The story of this world begins not with walls or battles, but with a single moment buried deep in the memory of time itself. 2,000 years before the present day, in an era when kingdoms rose and fell through the strength of human hands alone, there existed a tribal society known as Eldia. This was a time of conquest and territorial expansion, when stronger groups absorbed weaker ones, and the spoils of war included not just land and resources but people themselves. The world of that era was harsh and unforgiving, where survival depended on military strength and agricultural productivity. Small villages dotted the landscape, separated by forests and rivers, each community existing in precarious independence, until a stronger force arrived to claim them. Among those people reduced to the status of property through the simple mathematics of violence was a young girl whose name would echo through the centuries. Despite her humble origins, her name was Ymir. The world into which Ymir was born remains largely unknown to history. The village of her childhood existed somewhere beyond what would later become Eldian territory, a place with its own language, its own spiritual beliefs, its own patterns of daily life. Archaeological evidence suggests it might have been a farming community, the kind that raised livestock and grew grain in cleared fields, living in wooden structures with thatched roofs. The people would have worshipped gods whose names are now forgotten, celebrated festivals, marking the seasons, arranged marriages between families to strengthen social bonds. Children like Ymir would have grown up learning the skills they would need as adults. Girls trained in food preparation, textile work, and childcare, boys in hunting, defense, and agriculture. It was an ordinary life in an ordinary place, the kind that existed in countless locations across the ancient world. Ymir was not born into slavery. She came from this village, this community, and for the first years of her life, she knew freedom, in the simple sense that any child knows it, the freedom to play and learn within the boundaries of what her society allowed. But the Eldian expansion reached her village when she was still young, perhaps 8 or 9 years old enough to remember everything that happened, but too young to understand the larger forces at work. When Eldian warriors descended upon her homeland, they came not as isolated raiders, but as part of a systematic campaign of conquest. The Eldian military doctrine of that era focused on rapid strikes against settlements, overwhelming local defenders before they could organize effective resistance, then securing the population for labor and integration into the growing empire. The attack would have come at dawn, the traditional time for military operations, when defenders were least prepared. Fires consumed the wooden structures, sending smoke billowing into the morning sky. The sounds would have been chaotic and terrifying, the screams of people being cut down, the clash of weapons, the crackling of flames, the shouting of commands in a foreign language. Ymir's parents, like most of the adults, were killed in the initial assault. The Eldian strategy was to eliminate anyone old enough to lead resistance while preserving the young for assimilation. Children represented future labor, future soldiers, future subjects who could be molded into loyal servants of the empire. They were valuable in a way that their parents were not. The children who survived, Ymir among them, were gathered in the village center and subjected to a procedure that marked them as conquered peoples. Their tongues were cut out, a brutal practice designed to prevent them from speaking their native language or communicating effectively with each other. This mutilation served multiple purposes. It prevented conspiracies among the enslaved, made them incapable of teaching their original language to future generations, and marked them physically as property rather than people. The procedure was performed with crude efficiency, infection and death being acceptable losses. In a system that valued compliance over individual lives, Ymir survived the mutilation, as did many of the other children, and they were chained together and marched away from the smoldering ruins of everything they had known. The journey to Eldian territory took weeks, the children walking in lines connected by rope and chain, sleeping in whatever shelter the soldiers deemed adequate, fed just enough to keep them alive and moving. Some died along the way from infection, exhaustion, or despair. Those who survived arrived at the Eldian homeland to be distributed among various masters. Ymir ended up in the possession of the royal household itself, not because she was particularly strong or skilled, but through the simple accident of distribution. She became one of many slaves who maintained the infrastructure of Eldian power, working alongside others who could not speak, could not complain, could not even cry out when they were beaten. This was the standard practice of the time, a brutal efficiency that transformed conquered peoples into silent laborers who could not organize resistance or even cry out in pain. The Eldian Empire of this period relied heavily on slave labor for its agricultural production, construction projects, and domestic service. Slaves like Ymir existed at the very bottom of a rigid social hierarchy, beneath even the poorest free Eldian citizens. They slept in communal pens, structures that were barely more than animal shelters, where dozens of people were crowded together at night and locked in for security. During the day, they worked at whatever tasks their masters assigned, always under the watch of overseers who carried whips and clubs. Ymir became one of these voiceless servants, her identity stripped away, her humanity reduced to whatever labor her captors demanded. She hauled water, cleaned animal pens, carried heavy loads, performed the backbreaking tasks that no free person wanted to do. The years passed in this way, her childhood memories fading, her original language forgotten, except in dreams, her existence defined entirely by servitude. The Eldian king at this time was a man who would later be known simply as King Fritz. He was not the first of his line, nor would he be the last, but his actions would set in motion events that would define the next 2 millennia of human history. Fritz ruled through a combination of military might and ruthless pragmatism, expanding his territory through constant warfare and maintaining control through fear. Slaves like Ymir existed at the very bottom of this hierarchy, their lives valued only insofar as they could serve the needs of their masters. They slept in pens, like animals, were fed the bare minimum needed to keep them alive, and were beaten or killed at the slightest provocation. One night, whether through accident or intentional sabotage, some pigs escaped from their enclosure in the morning. When the loss was discovered, King Fritz demanded to know who was responsible. The slaves, knowing that silence would result in collective punishment, looked among themselves for someone to blame. Whether Ymir actually freed the pigs or whether she was simply chosen as a convenient scapegoat remains unknown. But when fingers pointed in her direction, she did not protest. She could not protest. Her tongue had been cut out years earlier. King Fritz, in what he must have considered a display of mercy, or perhaps entertainment, declared that Ymir would be set free. He removed her bonds, opened the gate of the slave pen, and told her to run. It was only after she had taken several steps into the forest that his warriors began their hunt. They pursued her with spears and dogs, treating the chase as sport rather than execution. Ymir ran through the forest, her bare feet tearing on roots and stones, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She had no destination, no plan, only the animal instinct to survive behind her. She could hear the shouts of the hunters and the baying of their hounds. She ran until her legs could no longer carry her, until blood from her wounds left a trail through the underbrush. Ahead, she saw an enormous tree, its trunk wider than any she had ever seen, its roots spreading across the forest floor like the fingers of a buried giant. At the base of this tree was an opening, a hollow space that looked like shelter. Without hesitation, Ymir plunged into the darkness. The hollow tree was deeper than it appeared. What looked like solid ground was actually a thin layer of organic matter covering a vast underground cavity. Ymir fell through this false floor, plummeting into a space filled with water that glowed with a strange pale light, her lungs filling with liquid as consciousness faded. But something else inhabited that subterranean pool. It was a creature unlike anything that had existed before, an organism that resembled an enormous spine, or a centipede composed of translucent segments that pulsed with internal light. This entity, which would later be described as the source of all living matter, had waited in the earth for countless ages. Whether it was alien in origin, a product of deep-time evolution, or something else entirely, no record exists to explain its nature. What is known is that when Ymir sank into the water, this creature reached out and fused with her body, merging with her spine and transforming her into something new. The transformation was instantaneous and total. Ymir's body erupted from the water, growing to an immense size, her flesh expanding and reshaping itself according to patterns that had never before existed in nature. She became the first Titan, a being of pure power and destructive capability. Her Titan form stood taller than the trees, her skin held together by visible muscles and sinew, her face fixed in an expression that seemed to hover between human awareness and animal rage. Steam rose from her body, the excess energy of transformation, escaping into the cool forest air. The hunters who had been pursuing her stopped at the tree line, their weapons suddenly insignificant in the face of this impossible creature. Ymir, still possessing her human consciousness within the Titan form, emerged from the forest. She had no training in her new abilities, no understanding of what she had become, but King Fritz recognized immediately that power had just fallen into his hands. Rather than flee or attempt to kill this monster, he approached her. He did not see a transformed slave, he saw a weapon. He told Ymir that she had been blessed with the power of the earth, that she was no longer a slave, but a servant of Eldia's divine right to rule. He ordered her to use her strength in his service, and Ymir, who had known nothing but obedience since her capture, complied. For 13 years, Ymir used her Titan abilities to expand the Eldian Empire in ways that permanently altered the political and geographic landscape of the entire known world. The transformation that had saved her from death in the forest became the tool through which King Fritz would achieve dominion over dozens of kingdoms and territories. Ymir's Titan form was not like the specialized forms that would later develop after her power was divided. She possessed the complete undiluted strength of the founding Titan, a being of such immense capability that witnesses struggled to even describe what they were seeing. Her size dwarfed anything else that existed, standing well over 100 meters tall. When fully transformed, her body composed of muscle and sinew that steamed constantly from the heat of its own energy production. The first tasks Fritz assigned to Ymir were infrastructural rather than military. He commanded her to clear the forests that separated Eldian settlements from potential farmland. Ymir would walk through ancient woodlands, her massive hands sweeping aside trees that had stood for centuries, creating cleared land in hours that would have taken human laborers years to achieve. The lumber from these forests became building material for Eldian expansion, but the real value was the arable land underneath. With Ymir's help, Eldia's agricultural output increased dramatically, allowing the population to grow and freeing more men for military service, since fewer were needed for farming. She built roads next, pathways that connected the scattered Eldian settlements into a cohesive network. These were not simple dirt paths, but engineered routes that Ymir created by compacting the earth with her footsteps. Then, using her Titan's ability to manipulate stone and soil, the roads facilitated trade, military movement, and communication, transforming Eldia from a collection of allied tribes into something approaching a true empire. She constructed bridges across rivers and gorges, massive stone structures that Ymir shaped with her hands, her Titan form allowing her to work in ways that defied human engineering capabilities. A bridge that might take human builders a decade to complete, Ymir finished in days. She dug irrigation channels that brought water to dry regions, turning marginal land into productive farms. She excavated harbors along the coast, creating ports where Eldian ships could dock safely, facilitating maritime trade and eventually naval power. She moved mountains, literally reshaping geography when a peak stood in the way of a desired route. She built fortifications, walls, and defensive structures that made Eldian cities nearly impregnable to conventional attack. The Eldian Empire, which had been merely one power among many in a fractious landscape of competing kingdoms and tribal confederations, became the dominant force across the entire region. Neighboring kingdoms watched in horror as this seemingly unstoppable giant transformed geography itself. They sent emissaries to Fritz, offering tribute and submission without fight, hoping to avoid the fate of those who resisted. But Fritz, his ambitions growing with each success, refused many of these offerings. He wanted not just nominal submission, but complete control, and he had the means to achieve it. The kingdoms that refused to submit, that attempted to maintain their independence through military resistance, discovered the true horror of the Titan. Ymir's most significant role was in warfare. When enemy armies gathered to resist Eldian expansion, when fortified cities closed their gates against Fritz's demands, Ymir became their doom. She walked through battlefields, her footsteps crushing soldiers beneath feet. The size of houses, a single step could kill dozens of men. their bodies pulverized beneath the weight. She toppled fortifications with her hands, stone walls that had stood for generations, crumbling like pottery when Ymir pushed against them. Her very presence caused enemy forces to scatter in terror, soldiers throwing down their weapons and fleeing, rather than face this impossible creature. The psychological impact of the Titan was perhaps more significant than the physical destruction. Armies are built on the assumption that courage and skill can overcome obstacles, that proper training and tactics can defeat any enemy. The Titan destroyed these assumptions completely. No amount of bravery mattered when your enemy could kill you accidentally by walking past. No tactical genius could devise a strategy against something that could not be harmed by any weapon you possessed. Cities that might have resisted conventional siege for months surrendered within days when the Titan appeared, their defenders recognizing the futility of resistance. Ymir fought in dozens of campaigns during these 13 years, each one adding to the Eldian domain. She destroyed the armies of mountain kingdoms that had thought their terrain would protect them. She waded into the ocean to attack island nations that had relied on their isolation for security. She pursued nomadic peoples across steppes and deserts, forcing them to submit or be exterminated. The body count from these campaigns numbered in the hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions. Entire ethnic groups were wiped out or absorbed. Their cultural identities dissolved into the growing Eldian mass. Languages disappeared. Religious traditions were suppressed or syncretized with Eldian beliefs. Political systems were replaced with Eldian administration. The most significant of Eldia's enemies was a maritime power known as Marley. The Marleyans controlled crucial sea routes and trading ports. Their wealth built on commerce, and their military strength derived from a sophisticated naval tradition. They looked at Eldia's rise with growing alarm, recognizing that no conventional military force could stand against the Titan. Marleyan generals attempted various strategies. They tried ambushes and poison and fire-massed archery. Everything their tactical expertise could devise, nothing worked. The Titan healed from wounds that would kill any normal creature, recovered from burns and blade cuts within moments, and could not be starved or exhausted. Marley's armies were decimated, their cities conquered, their people absorbed into the growing Eldian sphere. The Titan Wars, as they came to be known, reshaped the political geography of the entire continent. Dozens of independent kingdoms and city-states were brought under Eldian control, their populations becoming subjects of King Fritz. Throughout these 13 years, Ymir's relationship with King Fritz evolved in ways that deepened her tragedy. He took her as his concubine, and she bore him 3 daughters. The girls were named Maria, Rose, and Sina, names that would later be given to the 3 Great Walls. Whether Ymir felt anything approaching love for Fritz is a question that would haunt scholars for 2 millennia. But what is certain is that she never stopped serving him with complete devotion. She built his empire, fought his wars, and when the time came, she died for him. The moment that would define everything came during a public gathering. King Fritz stood before a crowd of his subjects, perhaps making some proclamation or accepting tribute. Among the crowd was a Marleyan prisoner of war, someone who had been brought to the Eldian capital as part of a group of slaves or hostages. This person, knowing they had nothing left to lose, produced a concealed spear. The weapon arced through the air toward King Fritz. Ymir, standing nearby in her human form, saw the spear's trajectory without hesitation. She moved to intercept the spear, struck her in the chest. The wound mortal, she fell to the ground, blood spreading across the stone. King Fritz looked down at her, and in that moment, his true nature was revealed. He felt no gratitude for her sacrifice, no sorrow at her impending death. Instead, he commanded her to stand up, to heal herself with her Titan powers, and continue serving. But Ymir, for the first time in 13 years, made a choice. She chose to die. Her Titan healing abilities could have saved her. The regenerative power that had closed countless battle wounds could have easily repaired the damage from a simple spear. But Ymir did not activate this power. She closed her eyes and let death come. Perhaps this was the only freedom she had ever exercised. The final rebellion of a woman who had never been allowed to decide anything about her own existence. But death did not bring Ymir peace. Instead, her consciousness found itself in a realm that existed outside normal space and time. This dimension, which would later be called the Paths, was a place of infinite desert and a vast, eternally branching tree. Here, Ymir's spirit remained, bound by the same chains of obedience that had defined her living existence. She had given everything to King Fritz, including her sense of self, and even death could not release her from that devotion. Back in the physical world, King Fritz ordered his 3 daughters to consume their mother's corpse. The girls, and Maria, and Rose, and Sina, were forced to eat Ymir's spine and major organs, an act of cannibalism that would establish a grim tradition. Through this consumption, Ymir's power was divided among the 3 daughters. Each now possessed the ability to transform into a titan, though none of them could match the complete power their mother had wielded. This marked the beginning of the inheritance cycle. The daughters grew, had children of their own, and when they neared the 13-year mark after their transformation, they too were consumed by their offspring. Over generations, Ymir's original power became fractured into 9 distinct forms, each with unique abilities and characteristics. These 9 titans became the pillars of Eldian power, each one developing distinct characteristics and capabilities that reflected the nature of its inheritors and the circumstances of its use. The founding titan, which contained the core of Ymir's original abilities, remained within the royal family descended from King Fritz. This titan possessed the fundamental power to control other titans, to command pure titans, like an army, to alter the bodies and memories of all Eldian descendants. Its inheritor could reach into the biology of every person with Eldian blood, changing their physical structure, erasing their memories, even making them immune to diseases. The founding titan was not primarily a combat form, though it possessed considerable size and strength. Its true power lay in control, in the ability to reshape reality for an entire ethnic group with a single command. The attack titan developed characteristics that remain mysterious even to scholars who studied it for generations. Of all the 9 powers, the attack titan was unique in its relationship with time. Its inheritors possessed the ability to see glimpses of the memories of future inheritors, fragments of what was to come. This meant that the attack titan could act with knowledge of future events, making choices that seemed inexplicable in the present, but served purposes that would only become clear years or decades later. The titan itself was of moderate size, around 15 meters, with a lean, muscular build optimized for combat rather than specialized tasks. Its face bore a distinctive appearance, all forward-facing teeth and intense eyes reflecting the relentless forward drive that characterized its inheritors. The attack titan seemed to attract people who valued freedom above all else, who would fight against any cage, no matter the cost. Throughout history, the attack titan changed hands more frequently than any other power, often through violent seizure rather than planned inheritance, as if the titan itself rejected any attempt to control or contain it. The colossal titan stood as the most visually impressive of the 9, its size dwarfing all others at 60 meters in height. The titan's body was so massive that it generated tremendous heat simply through existing, steam constantly rising from its flesh. When the colossal titan transformed, the process released explosive force equivalent to a meteor strike, the energy discharge capable of leveling everything within hundreds of meters. In combat, the colossal titan served as living siege weapon and area denial tool. Its presence made entire regions uninhabitable through heat alone, the temperature around it reaching levels that would boil water and ignite wood. But this power came with limitations. The energy expenditure required to maintain the colossal form was immense, meaning its inheritor could not stay transformed for extended periods. The titan moved slowly, its massive size making quick maneuvering impossible. Enemies who could keep their distance and wait out the transformation's duration had a chance to survive, though few possessed the discipline to do so when faced with such an overwhelming presence. The armored titan possessed the most straightforward of the special abilities, its entire body covered in hardened plates that functioned like natural armor. These plates could withstand artillery fire, sword strikes, even attacks from other titans. The hardening was not absolute concentrated force, could crack it, and repeated impacts could eventually break through, But in most combat situations, the armored Titan was effectively invulnerable. It stood around 15 meters tall, built heavily, with tremendous physical strength that allowed it to smash through fortifications and grapple with other Titans effectively. Eldian military doctrine developed specific roles for the armored Titan, using it to spearhead assaults, to break through enemy lines, to engage enemy Titans in direct combat, while more fragile forces maneuvered around it. The armored Titan was reliable and predictable, and a tool that commanders could deploy with confidence that it would perform its role effectively. The female Titan, despite its name, could be inherited by either sex, the designation referring to its appearance rather than its inheritors. This Titan possessed exceptional agility and combat skills, capable of complex martial arts techniques that other Titans could not match. Its most unusual ability was the capacity to call other Titans to its location through a distinctive scream, effectively commanding pure Titans as extensions of its will. This made the female Titan extremely dangerous in areas where pure Titans roamed, as it could summon entire hordes to overwhelm opponents. The Titan stood around 14 meters tall, built for speed and dexterity rather than raw power. Its face retained more human characteristics than most other Titans, and it demonstrated an unusual capacity for precision and control. Inheritors of the female Titan could sustain partial transformations, hardening specific body parts, or manifesting individual Titan features without full transformation, a flexibility that other shifters rarely achieved. The Beast Titan was perhaps the most variable of the 9, its form changing significantly based on its inheritor. While most Titans resembled giant humans, with various distortions, the Beast Titan often took animal characteristics. One inheritor might manifest as an ape-like creature, another as something resembling a horse or bird or other beast. Regardless of its specific form, the Beast Titan always possessed the ability to speak while transformed, making it the only Titan that could give complex orders and communicate strategically during battle. It also demonstrated the ability to command pure Titans, though not with the absolute authority of the founding Titan. The Beast Titan could give orders to mindless Titans, directing their attacks with strategic precision. This combination of speech and command made the Beast Titan invaluable for coordinating large-scale operations, effectively functioning as a field commander who could both participate in combat and direct forces simultaneously. The Jaw Titan was the smallest of the 9, standing only around 5 meters in height, but it possessed devastating offensive capability. Its jaws could bite through anything, including the hardened skin of other Titans, making it one of the few powers capable of harming the armored Titan directly. Its claws were similarly enhanced, capable of tearing through materials that would stop normal weapons. The small size made the Jaw Titan extremely fast and maneuverable, able to dodge attacks from larger opponents and strike at weak points with precision. In military operations, the Jaw Titan served as an assassin and infiltrator, slipping past defenses that would stop larger Titans and eliminating high-value targets with quick, brutal efficiency. Its small size also meant its inheritor consumed less energy during transformation, allowing for longer sustained operations than most other shifters could manage. The Cart Titan stood out not for combat ability, but for endurance. Its inheritors could maintain Titan form for months at a time, far longer than any other shifter. The Titan walked on all fours, resembling a quadrupedal animal, with a large flat back perfect for carrying cargo or mounted weapons. Its role in Eldian military operations was logistical rather than combative, transporting supplies across terrain that would stop conventional vehicles carrying wounded soldiers from battlefields, moving equipment to locations where normal transportation was impossible. The Cart Titan could speak while transformed, similar to the Beast Titan, and it retained more of its inheritor's intelligence and personality than most other forms. In extended campaigns, the Cart Titan became invaluable, its ability to operate continuously without rest making it irreplaceable for sustained operations. The Warhammer Titan, the rarest and most mysterious of the 9, possessed the ability to create structures and weapons from hardened Titan material. Its inheritor could manifest spikes and hammers and bows, swords and shields, and entire fortifications, shaping hardened matter with their will. The creations were stronger than stone, sharp enough to pierce other titans, and could be generated almost instantaneously. The Warhammer Titan could even encase its true body in a crystal and operate its Titan form remotely through a cable connection, making the inheritor nearly impossible to extract. This defensive capability made the Warhammer extremely difficult to defeat, as opponents could destroy the Titan body repeatedly without harming the inheritor, hidden safely inside their crystal shell. The Tiber family, who inherited the Warhammer Titan, rarely deployed it in battle, preferring to hold it in reserve as a deterrent and symbol of power, rather than risking it in actual combat. With these 9 powers divided among loyal families, the Eldian Empire entered a period of unprecedented dominance that lasted well over 1,000 years. No nation could stand against the combined might of multiple titans. Eldian armies marched across continents, their titan wielders leading the way. Cities fell, kingdoms were absorbed, entire cultures were assimilated. The Eldians instituted a deliberate policy of interbreeding with conquered populations, ensuring that Eldian blood spread throughout their empire. These people, the descendants of Ymir through either direct lineage or interbreeding, became known as the subjects of Ymir. They all carried something in their biology that connected them to the original Titan, a factor in their blood that meant any of them could potentially be transformed into Titans through the proper methods. The Empire's growth was not entirely destructive. The Eldians built infrastructure, established trade routes, spread literacy and technology throughout their territories. But the foundation of their power remained violence, and the threat of violence conquered peoples lived with the knowledge that resistance meant facing the Titans. Stories spread of entire armies crushed beneath a single Titan's feet, of cities reduced to rubble when they refused to submit. The Empire developed a penal system that used Titan transformation as punishment. Criminals or political dissidents would be injected with spinal fluid taken from Titans, causing them to transform into mindless, pure Titans, creatures that retained the physical form and basic abilities, but lost all higher brain function, becoming monsters that existed only to hunt and consume humans. During this long period, several events shaped Eldian history. There was a great plague that swept through the world, killing millions. The plague did not discriminate between Eldian and non-Eldian populations, threatening to destroy the Empire's labor force and military strength. The king of that era, wielding the founding Titan, used its power to alter the biology of all subjects of Ymir. The modification made them immune to the disease, allowing Eldian populations to survive, while non-Eldians continued to die in massive numbers. This act both saved and cursed the subjects of Ymir, marking them as biologically distinct from the rest of humanity, a difference that would later be used to justify their persecution. Eldia also formed alliances during this period. Most notably, they established a relationship with Hizuru, an island nation located to the east. Hizuru possessed advanced technology and a warrior tradition built around a noble house known as the Azumabito clan. The alliance was sealed through marriages and mutual defense agreements. Some members of Hizuru's aristocracy, particularly those with Asian heritage, moved to Eldian territories, integrating themselves into the empire while maintaining their cultural identity. But empires, no matter how powerful, carry within them the seeds of their own destruction. The 9 Titan powers, rather than ensuring unity, created competition. The noble families who wielded these powers began to see themselves as rivals. Rather than allies, each house wanted more territory, more wealth, more influence. They started fighting among themselves, using their Titans against each other. Rather than against external enemies, these conflicts were initially contained, brief skirmishes that the royal family could mediate. But over time, the divisions deepened. Families formed alliances, creating factions that stood opposed to each other. The unity that had made Eldia invincible began to crack. 743 years before the fall of Wall Maria, these internal tensions erupted into open civil war. This conflict, known as the Great Titan War, represented the collapse of everything the Eldian Empire had built. 8 of the 9 Titan powers turned against each other, each family convinced that their vision of Eldia's future was correct, each unwilling to compromise. The king at this time, Fritz, was the 145th ruler in the Fritz line. He surveyed the bloodshed, the destroyed cities, the mountains of corpses created by titans fighting titans, and reached a conclusion that would change the course of history. He decided that the Eldian Empire should end. Karl Fritz's decision was not made public. Instead, he began a secret correspondence with the Tiber family, holders of the Warhammer Titan. The Tibers had always maintained some distance from the royal court, preferring to exert influence from behind the scenes, rather than seeking overt political power. Fritz convinced them that Eldia's crimes against the world were too great to be forgiven, that the empire built on Titan power had caused suffering on such a scale that it could never be justified. Together, they developed a plan to engineer Eldia's defeat. The plan required a scapegoat, someone for the oppressed peoples to rally behind. The Tibers created a fictional hero named Helos, a Marleyan warrior who supposedly stood against the Titans and defeated them through courage and martial skill. This story was pure fabrication, but it was a necessary narrative. People needed to believe that humans could defeat Titans, that the age of Eldian supremacy could end through human agency rather than Eldian mercy. The Tibers spread this story through Marleyan territories and among other subject peoples, allowing it to take root and grow. Meanwhile, Karl Fritz made preparations for evacuation. He gathered the majority of the royal family and as many Eldian citizens as he could convince to follow him. He also extended invitations to certain non-Eldian groups who had been allied with Eldia, particularly people from Hizuru, including members of the Azumabito clan and other Asian families. His destination was Paradis Island. A large landmass that lay across the sea from the mainland Paradise had been an Eldian territory for generations, used primarily as a penal colony where criminals were sent. Now, it would become a refuge. The exodus took place over several months. Ships carried people and supplies across the water. The mainland Eldian population, consumed by the civil war, barely noticed the royal family's departure. Some members of the Fritz line refused to go, choosing to stay and fight for what they saw as their ancestral right to rule. These dissenting royals would later be hunted down and eliminated by Marleyan forces. Once Karl Fritz and his followers reached Paradise, he employed the founding Titan's power for one final massive act of transformation. He commanded thousands of Colossus Titans to emerge and arrange themselves in 3 massive concentric circles. These Titans, each standing 60 meters tall, stood shoulder to shoulder, so close together that no gap existed between them. Then Fritz commanded them to harden their skin, to turn their outer flesh into a substance stronger than stone. The hardening process created 3 vast walls, each hundreds of kilometers in circumference, each standing 50 meters high. After Ymir's 3 daughters, a memorial to the woman whose power had started everything. Between these walls, the Eldian refugees established a new society. The territory was divided into districts, each with its own internal organization and economy. The outermost wall, Maria, protected the agricultural regions and smaller settlements. Wall rows enclosed the mid-sized cities and important infrastructure. Wall Sina, the innermost wall, surrounded the capital and the homes of the aristocracy. The Eldians built houses, planted crops, established schools and hospitals, created a functioning civilization within their self-imposed prison. Karl Fritz did not simply retreat behind walls and hope for the best. He employed the founding Titan's power to alter the memories of everyone who had come to Paradise. He erased their knowledge of the outside world, making them forget that humanity existed beyond the walls. He implanted false memories, convincing them that the Titans had destroyed all human civilization, except for the people behind the walls. This massive act of mental manipulation created a society that believed itself to be humanity's last stand against extinction. The people behind the walls developed their own myths and origin stories, explanations for their situation that had nothing to do with the truth. Not everyone lost their memories. Certain families, those who were not subjects of Ymir, and therefore not susceptible to the founding Titan's memory alteration, retained the truth. These included the Ackerman family, a bloodline that had served as the royal family's bodyguards for generations, and members of the Asian clans who had come from Hizuru. Fritz made these families swear oaths of secrecy, threatening them with persecution if they revealed the truth. Many accepted this bargain, choosing to live as nobles within the walls rather than risk destruction. Others refused and were hunted down by the newly formed military police brigade, an internal security force tasked with protecting the government's secrets. To maintain this deception and protect the royal bloodline, Karl Fritz implemented one final measure. He changed his family name from Fritz to Reis, then selected a puppet king from a cadet branch of the family who would rule in name, while the true royals lived in secret. This way, if someone attempted to steal the founding titan or assassinate the king, they would target the wrong family. The Reis family maintained the founding titan, in secret passing it from parent to child, through the same brutal process of consumption that had marked titan inheritance. For 2,000 years, the society behind the walls developed its own character over the century of isolation, creating a unique culture shaped by the constant threat that loomed beyond the stone barriers. The walls were not just physical structures, but psychological anchors defining how people thought about their world and their place in it. The population distribution reflected both practical needs and social hierarchy. The outermost territory between walls, Maria and Rose, contained the agricultural districts, vast fields where crops were grown and livestock raised to feed the population. These rural areas were considered dangerous, closer to the Titans, and the people who lived there were generally from lower social classes, farmers and laborers, who had no choice but to risk the proximity to the wall's edge. The towns and cities within this outer ring were heavily fortified, built with evacuation routes and emergency shelters, in case Titans ever breached the outer wall. Between walls Rose and Sina lay the mid-sized cities and most of the industrial infrastructure. This is where craftsmen worked, where markets thrived, where the middle class lived in relative safety. These cities had running water systems, paved streets, gas lamps for illumination, all the marks of an advancing civilization. The architecture showed distinct influences from various periods. Older structures built in one style, standing alongside newer buildings that reflected changing tastes and technologies. People here could live almost normal lives, their daily routines not immediately threatened by Titans, though the knowledge of the outer wall's importance weighed on everyone. Within walls Sina resided the capital, the nobles, the wealthy merchant families, and the central government. This innermost territory was the safest, the farthest from any potential breach, and consequently the most expensive and prestigious place to live. The architecture within Sina reflected this wealth. Buildings constructed from the finest stone, decorated with elaborate carvings, surrounded by gardens and public spaces that showed a society with resources to spare for beauty. The king's palace stood at the center, though the king himself was rarely seen by common people. His rule expressed through proclamations, read by town criers, and enforced by the military police brigade. The walls themselves were considered sacred by many. A religion had formed around them. Priests teaching that the walls were divine gifts, that their construction had been a miracle performed by powers beyond human understanding. This wall cult, while not universal, had enough adherents to influence policy. The priests taught that even touching the walls was blasphemy, that to damage them or attempt to breach them would invite divine punishment. The government quietly encouraged this belief, as it served their purposes perfectly. If people believed the walls were sacred, they would not investigate them too closely, would not discover the colossal titans hidden within the apparently solid stone structure. The religion also provided psychological comfort, transforming defensive structures into evidence of divine protection, making the trapped population feel chosen rather than imprisoned. Education behind the walls was mandatory for children, with schools teaching reading and writing and mathematics and history, as the government wanted it understood. The history lessons taught that Titans had appeared roughly 100 years ago, that they had driven humanity to the brink of extinction, that only the walls saved the remnants of civilization. Students learned that the world beyond the walls was empty, except for Titans, that their society represented the last bastion of human culture. They were taught to be grateful for the walls, to respect the military that protected them, to accept their place in the social order. Critical thinking about these foundational myths was not encouraged. Teachers who asked uncomfortable questions about logical inconsistencies in the official history found themselves transferred to remote schools or dismissed entirely. The military developed three distinct branches, each with its own culture and reputation. The Survey Corps, which ventured beyond the walls to fight Titans and explore what lay beyond, was seen as simultaneously the most courageous and most foolish branch. Survey Corps missions had staggering casualty rates, often losing 30% or more of their personnel on a single expedition. They mapped the territory beyond Wall Maria, attempted to establish forward bases, studied Titan behavior, and searched for ways to reclaim lost ground. Most people viewed the Survey Corps as admirable but doomed. Brave individuals, sacrificing themselves for minimal gain families, grieved when their children joined the Scouts, knowing the odds heavily favored them, never returning. The garrison regiment manned the walls and protected the cities, a much larger force than the Survey Corps, responsible for the day-to-day security of human territory. Garrison soldiers stood watch on the walls looking for approaching Titans, ready to sound alarms if the defenses were threatened. They trained to use the cannons mounted on the walls, artillery pieces that could damage but rarely kill Titans. They practiced evacuation procedures, ensuring that if a breach occurred, civilians could reach safety, while soldiers bought time with their lives. The garrison was seen as respectable and necessary, and a career path that offered decent pay and reasonable survival. Odds most soldiers ended up in the garrison, making it the backbone of military defense. The Military Police Brigade, the most prestigious and sought-after branch, served within Walsina, ostensibly protecting the king and maintaining order in the capital. In reality, the MPs functioned more as a tool of internal control than external defense. They investigated crimes, suppressed dissent, conducted surveillance on anyone the government deemed suspicious. The top 10 graduates from each training class were eligible to join the military police, making it a coveted position for those who wanted safety and prestige. Many MPs came from noble families or had connections to power, using military service as a stepping stone to political careers. Corruption was endemic in the military police. Officers accepting bribes, abusing their authority, living comfortable lives while soldiers in other branches died defending the walls. The omnidirectional mobility gear that allowed humans to fight Titans represented one of the great technological achievements of the society behind the walls. The device used compressed gas to launch grappling hooks, attached to steel cables, allowing the user to swing through three-dimensional space with extraordinary speed and agility. When properly used, the gear let a trained soldier move like a bird swinging between buildings or trees, achieving angles of attack that would otherwise be impossible. The swords used with the gear were disposable blades designed to be replaced quickly when they dulled. Fighting Titans required cutting through the nape of the neck, a specific weak point where the Titan's true body connected to the larger form. Hitting this target while moving at high speed, while the Titan moved and tried to grab you, required skills that took years to develop. Training to use the ODM gear was brutal and dangerous. Cadets spent months learning basic balance and control before they were allowed to use the gear in combat situations. Many washed out during training, unable to handle the physical demands or the motion sickness that came with constant spinning and flipping through the air. Those who graduated became humanity's main weapon against the Titans, though the survival rates were still grim. A Survey Corps soldier's average lifespan after joining was less than 5 years. Most died on their first few expeditions, either caught by Titans or suffering equipment failures that sent them falling to their deaths. The economy behind the walls had developed its own characteristics. During the century of isolation, with no external trade and fixed territory, the economic system had to be carefully managed to prevent resource depletion. The government controlled the distribution of critical resources, setting quotas for production and consumption. Food prices were regulated, preventing hoarding and speculation. Technological development focused on efficiency rather than expansion, finding ways to do more with the same limited resources. The society had achieved a relatively high standard of living for most citizens. Though this came at the cost of individual freedom and economic mobility, people were generally assigned to professions based on aptitude and need rather than personal choice, though some flexibility existed for those with the right connections or exceptional talents. The culture that developed behind the walls showed both resignation and hope. People married, raised children, pursued hobbies, created art and music. All the things that humans do even when living under constant threat. There was a pervading sense that this was the natural state of the world, that humanity had always lived behind walls. Though the official history said otherwise, the older generation that remembered life before the fall of wall Maria carried trauma that colored everything, while the younger generation knew only the restricted world of walls, Rose and Sina. Dreams of seeing the ocean, of exploring the world beyond the walls, of defeating all titans and reclaiming the planet. These dreams sustained hope, even when rational analysis suggested they were impossible fantasies. The people behind the walls had no idea that their entire existence was built on lies. They did not know that they were Eldians, that they were descended from people who had once ruled the world. Through Titan power, that humanity thrived beyond the sea. They believed the story they had been taught, that Titans appeared roughly 100 years ago, that they drove humanity to the brink of extinction, that only the walls saved them. Young people grew up with this narrative, their ambitions and fears shaped by what they believed to be the truth. Meanwhile, on the mainland, Marley took advantage of Eldia's collapse. With most Eldians now isolated on Paradis Island, and the 8 non-founding Titan powers in chaos, Marley moved to seize control. They succeeded in capturing 7 of the 8 powers. Only the attack Titan escaping their grasp. Marley's strategy was to use Eldian power against Eldians themselves. They established internment zones, ghettos, where Eldians were forced to live under tight restrictions. Eldians in Marleyan territory were marked by armbands, stripped of most civil rights, subjected to constant surveillance and propaganda that portrayed them as devils and demons. Children were taught that their ancestors had committed unspeakable atrocities, that they bore generational guilt for 2,000 years of oppression. But Marley also needed Eldians. For military purposes, the 7 Titans they had captured were too valuable to leave unused. They created the warrior program, identifying Eldian children with potential, indoctrinating them with Marleyan ideology, training them to fight for Marley's interests, and eventually granting them Titan powers. These warriors were promised that their service would grant their families honorary Marleyan status, lifting them out of the internment zones and giving them some measure of safety. It was a cruel bargain, asking children to become weapons against their own people. But for many Eldian families, it seemed like the only path to security. Marley's treatment of Eldians was justified through propaganda that twisted history. They emphasized the violence of the Eldian Empire, while erasing their own past as the ones who had first provoked Eldian expansion. They created myths about Ymir Fritz, claiming that she had made a pact with a devil to gain her powers, that she had been a monster rather than a victim. These stories spread throughout the world, shaping how everyone outside Paradis viewed Eldians. The result was a global consensus that Eldians were dangerous, that they carried the potential for Titan transformation in their blood, and that they should be restricted, controlled, or eliminated for the safety of humanity. For over a century, the status quo held the people behind the walls, lived in ignorant isolation, believing themselves to be humanity's last hope. The Eldians on the mainland suffered under Marleyan oppression, their identity synonymous with shame and danger. The true royal family on Paradis, the Reese line, inherited the founding Titan generation after generation, each ruler bound by Karl Fritz's vow to renounce war. This vow, embedded in the founding Titan's power itself, meant that any royal who inherited the Titan would instantly submit to Fritz's will, accepting his belief that Eldians deserved their fate and should not resist if the world chose to exterminate them. During this period, a few events disturbed the peace behind the walls. Some individuals began questioning the official narrative. There were those who investigated the wall's true nature, trying to understand how such structures could have been built. The government responded to such investigations with lethal force. One such questioner was a teacher who developed a theory about the king's ability to alter memories. A theory he discussed with his young son. The boy, not understanding the danger, repeated this theory to his classmates. When this came to the attention of the authorities, the teacher was murdered, made to look like an accident. The boy's name was Erwin Smith, and his father's death would shape the rest of his life. In Marley, roughly 80 years after the Great Titan War, the situation began to shift. Marley had used its captured titans to establish itself as a world power, but its dominance was beginning to falter. Other nations were developing new technologies, modern weaponry that could potentially challenge Titan power. Marley's economy, built on conquest and extraction, required constant expansion to sustain itself. The nation began looking for new sources of resources, new territories to exploit. Paradis Island, which they had largely ignored for a century, suddenly became valuable. Scouts reported that the island contained vast deposits of a fuel source, something that could power the machines and vehicles of an industrializing world. Marley's military command developed a plan. They could not launch a conventional invasion because that would provoke the rumbling. The threat Fritz had made when he retreated to Paradise. Fritz had promised that if anyone attacked the island, he would unleash the millions of colossal titans within the walls to flatten the entire world. Marley, through the Tiber family's secret knowledge, knew this threat was hollow. They knew about Fritz's vow renouncing war, knew that the king would never actually activate the rumbling. But they could not be certain, and the risk was too great to challenge directly. Instead, they decided on infiltration. 806 years before the present day, in a Marleyan internment zone called Liberio, a boy named Grisha Yeager was born. He grew up in the harsh conditions that defined Eldian life under Marleyan rule, learning from an early age what it meant to be hated for your ancestry. Grisha had a younger sister named Faye. When Grisha was around 10 years old, an airship came to Liberio, a marvel of technology that the children desperately wanted to see up close. Grisha and Faye snuck out of the internment zone to see where the airship landed, a simple act of childhood curiosity. They were caught by a Marleyan public security officer, a man who saw two Eldian children outside their designated area. Grisha was beaten, but allowed to return to the zone. Faye was taken away. Grisha's parents were told that she had been detained and would be returned. Days passed, then weeks. Finally, her body was found in a canal, partially eaten by dogs. The official report claimed she had wandered into the wrong area and been attacked. But Grisha later learned the truth from another officer who had been there. The public security officer who had caught them had fed Faye to his dogs while she was still alive, treating a child's murder as entertainment. This trauma marked Grisha for life, but it took years for him to turn that grief into action. As a young man, he was approached by a resistance group called the Eldian Restorationists. This group believed that Eldia should be restored to its former glory, that Eldians should reclaim their dignity and power. Their ideology was complex, mixing legitimate grievances against Marleyan oppression with nostalgia for imperial conquest. Grisha, angry at the world that had killed his sister, joined them. The Restorationists had a member who was particularly valuable, a woman named Fritz. She was a direct descendant of the royal family, one of the few royals who had not gone to Paradise with Fritz. Dina believed that the Eldian Empire's fall had been a betrayal, that Fritz had abandoned his people to suffering and persecution. She married Grisha, and they had a son named Zeke. Grisha saw in his son the potential for liberation. If they could somehow infiltrate Paradise, if Zeke could make contact with the royal family's founding titan and convince them to use it, perhaps they could overthrow Marley and restore Eldian power. The Restorationists also had a mole within the Marleyan government, someone who fed them information and resources. This person went by the codename Owl. Nobody in the Restorationists, not even the leaders, knew the Owl's true identity. When Zeke reached the appropriate age, Grisha pushed him to join the warrior program. The plan was for Zeke to rise through the ranks, gain Marley's trust, inherit one of the titans, and use his position to sabotage Marleyan operations. Grisha trained his son relentlessly, teaching him Eldian history, instilling in him the importance of their mission. He did not realize that this pressure was destroying his relationship with his son. Zeke, a child who just wanted his father's approval, found himself crushed under the weight of expectations he could not meet. Within the warrior program, Zeke met Tom Casaver, a scientist who had inherited the Beast Titan for research purposes rather than combat. Casaver became the father figure that Grisha had never been offering Zeke: kindness and understanding. When Casaver learned about Grisha's pressure on Zeke, He advised the boy that he could make his own choices eventually. When Zeke overheard his parents discussing their plans, he made a decision. He reported his parents and all the restorationists to Marleyan authorities. The Marleyans conducted a mass arrest. The restorationists were brought to Paradis Island, to a location near the walls where pure titans roam. One by one, they were injected with titan spinal fluid and pushed off a wall, transforming them into mindless titans, condemned to wander forever. Grisha, watching his comrades transform, watching his wife Dina become a monster, waited for his own turn. But then, one of the Marleyan officers, a man named Kruger, turned on his fellow soldiers. He killed them and revealed himself to be the Owl, the restorationists' secret ally within the government. Kruger possessed the Attack Titan, a power he had hidden from Marley for years. He explained to Grisha that the Attack Titan had unique properties, that its inheritors could see glimpses of the memories of future inheritors, fragments of what was to come. Kruger said that he had seen a future where someone would end the cycle of hatred and violence, but that this future required specific actions. He commanded Grisha to infiltrate Paradise, to blend in with the people behind the walls, to start a family and live among them. Eventually, when the time was right, Grisha would need to steal the founding Titan from the royal family. Kruger then transformed into the Attack Titan, bit himself to draw blood, and transferred his power to Grisha by having Grisha consume him. Grisha found himself on Paradise Island. Outside wall, Maria transformed back to human form, with memories and powers he did not fully understand. He was found by Survey Corps members, who assumed he had somehow lost his memories due to trauma. They brought him inside the walls, and Grisha began building a new life. He became a doctor using medical knowledge he had from Marley. To help people, he opened a clinic in Shiganshina district, the southernmost settlement. He was careful never to speak about the outside world, playing the role of a man who had lost his past. Years passed. Grisha met a woman named Carla, a kind person who worked in a restaurant. They married, and she became pregnant. In the year 830, their son was born. Grisha named him Eren, a name he said felt right. For reasons he could not fully explain, Eren grew up not knowing his father's secrets. He was a normal boy, adventurous and hot-headed, friends with a quiet boy named Armin Arlert. When Eren was 9 years old, he saved a girl named Mikasa Ackerman from kidnappers who had murdered her parents. Eren killed 2 grown men to save Mikasa, showing a willingness to fight that both disturbed and defined him. Mikasa, having lost her family, was adopted by the Yeagers, becoming Eren's sister in all but blood. Eren grew up with dreams of joining the Survey Corps and exploring beyond the walls. His mother opposed this, not wanting to lose her son to the dangerous world outside. His father was more supportive, seeing in Eren something that connected to his mission, though he never explained what that was. Grisha had a basement beneath his house, a locked room that supposedly contained his medical equipment. In reality, it contained 3 books he had written, journals detailing his true origins and the truth about the world. He kept these hidden, waiting for the right moment to reveal them. Meanwhile, Marley had finalized its plans for the Paradise Island operation. They selected 4 warriors to carry out the mission. Reiner Braun, who would inherit the armored Titan; Bertolt Hoover, who would receive the colossal Titan; Annie Leonhardt, who would gain the female Titan; and Marcel Galliard, who held the Jaw Titan. Zeke, now a teenager and holder of the Beast Titan, would coordinate from outside the walls. The plan was simple: breach the walls, allow pure Titans to flood into human territory, create chaos that would force the founding Titan to reveal itself. Once the founding Titan showed itself, the warriors would capture it and return it to Marley. 845 years after the start of the calendar used within the walls, on a day that would be remembered as the fall of Wall Maria, the operation began. Eren Yeager woke that morning from a strange dream, an image of his father showing him something important. He found himself sitting under a tree with Mikasa, tears streaming down his face for reasons he could not explain. Mikasa asked what was wrong, but Eren could not answer. They returned home, where Carla chided Eren for his plans to join the Survey Corps, and Grisha prepared to leave on a house call to visit a family in another district. That afternoon, As Eren and his friends watched the Survey Corps return from another failed expedition, reality shattered. The colossal titan appeared, a 60-meter-tall horror that manifested in an explosion of steam and lightning. Its appearance was impossible according to everything people understood about titans. The walls were 50 meters high, and titans could not climb them, but the colossal titan was taller than the walls. It brought its foot down on the outer gate, obliterating the barrier that had protected Shiganshina for a century. The impact sent debris flying, killing people instantly through the breach. Pure titans began flooding into the district. Eren ran home, desperate to reach his mother. He found their house crushed beneath a boulder, Carla trapped under rubble with her legs. Pinned Mikasa was already there, trying to free her. Eren and Mikasa pulled at the debris, but they were children, not strong enough. Carla, seeing another pure titan approaching, begged them to run. She told them to leave her, to survive. A Survey Corps soldier appeared, a man named Hannes who had been friends with the family. He grabbed Eren and Mikasa and ran, carrying them away, as Carla screamed for them not to look back. Eren looked anyway. He saw a pure titan, a female form with unusual features, reach down and pick up his mother. He saw it tear her in half and consume her upper body. This moment broke something in Eren and created something else. The grief and rage he felt went beyond what any child should experience. He screamed his promise into the burning city. He would kill every titan, every last one of them. Mikasa held him as he wept, her own trauma from watching her second family destroyed mixing with his. The refugees from Wall Maria fled behind Wall Rose, becoming displaced persons who survived on government assistance and the resentment of people who had to share resources. Mikasa and Armin lived in a refugee camp, their futures uncertain. Grisha had not been in Shiganshina when it fell. He returned as soon as he heard finding his family among the refugees that night. Grisha took Eren into the forest. He told his son that he needed to show him the basement when they retook Wall Maria, that everything would make sense. Then Grisha injected Eren with a titan serum. Eren transformed into a mindless pure titan. Grisha, using his attack titan form, positioned himself in front of his son and allowed himself to be eaten. In that moment of consumption, the attack titan's power transferred to Eren, and Grisha's memories began flowing into his son's mind. Eren transformed back to human form, with no clear memory of what had happened, finding himself collapsed in the forest, with a strange injection mark on his arm. The next day, Grisha was nowhere to be found. People assumed he had died in the chaos of Wall Maria's fall. Eren, Mikasa, and Armin, now orphans, or effectively so, decided to join the military. When they were old enough, they entered training 2 years after the fall, learning to use the omni-directional mobility gear that allowed humans to fight titans by flying through the air on gas-powered winches with sword blades. The training was brutal, designed to weed out those who could not handle the physical and psychological stress of fighting creatures that saw humans as food. Eren proved to be mediocre at most aspects of training. His hand-to-hand combat was good, his determination unquestionable, but his technical skills with the gear were inconsistent. Mikasa, by contrast, was a prodigy. The most skilled cadet in their class, Armin, struggled physically, but showed strategic brilliance. They were part of the 104th Training Corps, a group that included Reiner, Bertolt, and Annie, the warriors from Marley, though Eren had no idea that 3 of his fellow trainees were his enemies. 5 years after Wall Maria fell, just as the 104th Corps was about to graduate, the colossal titan reappeared. It struck Trost District, the southern city of Wall Rose, breaching the outer gate, just as it had at Wall Maria. The newly graduated cadets were thrown immediately into combat. The battle became a slaughter. Titans poured into the city, devouring soldiers and civilians alike. Eren watched another friend die, saw him bitten in half by a titan. Rage overwhelmed Eren, and he attacked recklessly, getting his leg bitten off by another titan. As he fell toward a titan's mouth, he pushed Armin out of the way, sacrificing himself so his friend could live. Eren was swallowed in the darkness of the titan's stomach. As acid began dissolving his body, something awakened within the deepest parts of his consciousness. The pain was beyond description. his flesh burning away layer by layer, his nerves screaming signals that his brain could barely process. He should have died there, dissolved into biological matter to fuel the pure Titan's mindless existence. But Eren's body carried within it the attack Titan and the founding Titan, powers inherited from his father 5 years earlier, powers that had lain dormant, waiting for the right trigger. The trauma of being devoured, the desperate rage at dying when he had sworn to fight, the memory of his mother's death, all of these emotions converged in a single moment of absolute determination. Eren's consciousness touched something deep in his inherited memories, a power and purpose he did not intellectually understand, but recognized on an instinctive level. He remembered his father's injection, though the memory had been suppressed. He remembered consuming someone, though he could not have said who or why. These fragmented memories connected with his present trauma, creating a bridge between his human will and the Titan transformation capabilities encoded in his biology. His body began to change, but not into a pure Titan, like those created through simple injection of spinal fluid. The attack Titan was emerging, a 15-meter being of pure muscle and furious determination. The transformation generated enormous amounts of heat and energy. Inside the pure Titan's stomach, Eren's changing body began to expand, generating steam that cooked the Titan from within. Flesh tore, bones cracked. The pure Titan's body, unable to contain the force erupting from its digestive tract. The attack Titan burst forth like a horrific birth, Eren's new form, tearing free of the larger Titan's body, emerging in an explosion of steam and tissue. The transformation was not clean or controlled. Eren's consciousness barely held together, his human mind struggling to process the sensory input from the attack Titan's body, to understand how to move limbs that felt simultaneously familiar and completely alien. When Eren opened his Titan's eyes, he saw the world from 15 meters high, everything distorted by the Titan's different vision. He could smell other Titans, could somehow sense them in ways his human senses could not explain. The attack Titan's instincts accumulated from previous inheritors flooded his awareness. He knew how to fight without having been taught, his body moving according to patterns established by warriors who had held this power centuries ago. The attack Titan's appearance reflected Eren's inner nature, all forward-facing teeth and a permanent grimace, eyes intense and focused, body lean and powerful, built for relentless forward assault rather than defense or strategic maneuvering. The attack Titan erupted from inside the Titan that had swallowed Eren, ripping free with primal fury. It began attacking other Titans, fighting with a savagery that shocked everyone watching. Eren, in his Titan form, was not fully in control. His consciousness merged with the Titan's instincts, creating a being that operated on rage and the desire to destroy Titans. He killed Titan after Titan, his regenerative abilities letting him recover from wounds that would have stopped any normal fighter. Eventually, Eren's Titan form collapsed from exhaustion. Eren emerged from the nape, the weak point where the Titan's true body connected to the larger form. Survey Corps members, led by Captain Levi Ackerman, secured him and brought him before Commander Erwin Smith. The revelation that a human could transform into a Titan and retain enough control to fight other Titans changed everything. Eren was both a potential weapon and a potential threat. Some in the military government wanted him executed, seeing him as a monster. Others, particularly Erwin, saw an opportunity. Eren was placed under the Survey Corps' custody, specifically under Captain Levi's direct supervision. The Survey Corps began planning an operation to retake Wall Maria, to return to Shiganshina and seal the breach that had led to 5 years of suffering. Eren trained to control his transformation, learning to shift at will and to maintain his consciousness. While in Titan form, it was discovered that he could harden parts of his Titan body, creating structures stronger than normal Titan flesh. This ability would be crucial for sealing the wall's breach. But complications arose. Annie, who had joined the military police brigade, was revealed to be the female Titan that had attacked during an earlier operation. She had been trying to kidnap Eren, though her purpose was unclear. When confronted, Annie transformed and fought her way through the capital, causing massive destruction before Eren managed to defeat her in Titan form. Annie encased herself in a crystal shell that could not be broken, putting herself in suspended animation. Rather than allowing capture, the government took custody of her crystallized form, uncertain what to do with it. Further investigations revealed more traitors. Reiner and Bertolt, two of Eren's trusted comrades from the training corps, were discovered to be the armored and colossal titans. They had been the ones who breached the walls 5 years ago, and they were now trying again to complete their mission. A battle erupted on top of Wall Rose, with Eren fighting Reiner in titan form, while Survey Corps members attempted to stop Bertolt. The battle ended inconclusively, with Reiner and Bertolt escaping alongside Ymir, another soldier who had revealed herself as a titan shifter, specifically the Jaw Titan. These revelations forced a reckoning with reality. If humans from outside the walls possessed titan powers, then the official story about humanity being extinct beyond the walls was a lie. Some members of the government had known this truth, and they had killed to keep it secret. Commander Erwin had long suspected that the government was hiding the truth. His suspicions rooted in his father's murder years earlier. Now he had proof. The scout regiment, working with reformist elements in the military, staged a coup against the false king and the corrupt elements of the government. Historia Reese, previously known as Crystal Lens, was revealed to be the illegitimate daughter of Rod Reus, the true king and holder of the founding titan. Rod attempted to convince Historia to eat Eren and inherit the founding titan herself, which would allow the royal family to regain full control. But Historia refused, recognizing that inheriting the founding titan would mean surrendering to Karl Fritz's will, accepting humanity's destruction as deserved punishment for Eldian sins. Rod Reese, desperate, consumed the titan serum himself and transformed into an abnormally large pure titan. The creature crawled toward the capital, threatening to destroy everything. Historia, with help from the Survey Corps, fought and killed her father. She was crowned queen, the first monarch in a century to rule without hiding behind a puppet, the first to know the truth about the walls and the world beyond. With a legitimate government finally in place, the Survey Corps prepared for the operation to retake Wall Maria. Erwin Smith, commander of the Scouts, knew this would likely be his final mission. He had spent his entire adult life seeking the truth about the world, driven by the mystery his father had died trying to solve. Now, with the basement holding Grisha's secrets just within reach, Erwin faced the reality that he might have to sacrifice himself before learning those secrets. The operation began with a small force. Around 100 soldiers, they rode through the night, reaching Shiganshina at dawn. The plan was straightforward. Eren would use his hardening ability to seal the outer gate. Then they would seal the inner gate, removing the Titan's access to the interior. But the warriors were waiting. Reiner engaged them almost immediately, and Bertolt descended from the wall itself in his colossal Titan form, crushing dozens of soldiers in an instant with his transformation's explosive force. What followed was the Battle of Shiganshina, a desperate struggle that would determine humanity's future within the walls. Eren fought Reiner again, the two titans grappling with savage intensity. Bertolt's colossal titan radiated heat so intense that it turned the surrounding area into a furnace, making approach nearly impossible. The beast titan appeared on the wall, revealed to be controlled by Zeke Yeager, Grisha's first son and Eren's half-brother, though Eren did not yet know this. Zeke commanded a force of pure titans and began throwing chunks of the wall at the Survey Corps with deadly accuracy. The Corps suffered catastrophic losses. Soldiers were crushed by thrown debris, burned by the colossal titan's heat, or devoured by pure titans. Commander Erwin led a suicide charge against the beast titan, knowing that the only way to create an opening was through mass sacrifice. He led the recruits directly at Zeke, their only chance being to distract him long enough for Captain Levi to close the distance. Erwin was struck by one of Zeke's throws and fell, mortally wounded, as were all the other charging soldiers. Humanity's strongest soldier reached Zeke and delivered a brutal assault that left the beast titan critically wounded. Zeke escaped by hiding inside his titan's body, while other titans carried him away. But he was defeated. Reiner, fighting against Eren and other soldiers simultaneously, was eventually extracted from his armored titan and left for dead. Bertolt, confident in the colossal titan's overwhelming power, was trapped by Armin's strategy. Armin sacrificed himself by allowing the colossal titan to burn him nearly to death, creating the opening for Eren to pull Bertolt from the nape. In the aftermath, Captain Levi held the one remaining injection of Titan serum, a vial that could transform someone into a pure Titan. Both Erwin and Armin were dying. Levi faced an impossible choice: save the brilliant commander who had led humanity this far, or save the young man who represented hope and dreams. After agonizing deliberation, seeing that Erwin was ready for death after a lifetime of guilt and burden, Levi chose to save Armin. Armin was injected with the serum, transformed into a pure Titan, and consumed Bertolt, inheriting the colossal Titan's power. The Battle of Shiganshina ended with humanity's victory, but at tremendous cost. Of the 100 or so soldiers who departed, only 9 survived. Levi and Hangi and Eren, Mikasa and Armin and Connie, Sasha, Jean, and a new recruit named Flock. They had defeated 3 Titan shifters, but the cost was nearly everyone they had served with Commander. Erwin Smith was buried with honor, and Hangi Zoe became the new commander of the Survey Corps. Now, and finally, and they could reach the basement. The survivors traveled to Eren's old house in Shiganshina, descending the stairs to the locked room Grisha had kept secret. The key Grisha had given Eren 5 years earlier did not fit the basement door, disappointing them, until Mikasa accidentally discovered a hidden keyhole in Grisha's desk. The key opened a secret drawer containing 3 books and a photograph. The photograph showed Grisha with a woman and young boy, all dressed in elegant clothes. On the back, Grisha had written an explanation. This was not a drawing, but a photograph, an image captured using technology that did not exist within the walls. Grisha had come from beyond the walls, from a place where humanity lived in civilization. The truth that humanity had not been wiped out, that it thrived beyond the sea, was now undeniable. The books detailed Grisha's life. They explained Marley, the Eldian internment zones, the warriors, the Titan's true nature. They revealed that all people within the walls were Eldians, descendants of Ymir Fritz, and that the Titans were other Eldians who had been transformed as punishment. The founding of the walls had not been a miraculous salvation, but a deliberate retreat, a king's decision to escape from the world and its hatred. 2,000 years of history poured from those pages, shattering every belief that people behind the walls had held about themselves. The Survey Corps shared this information with the new government Historia, as Queen made the difficult decision to reveal the truth to the public. Meetings were held, information carefully released, society grappling with a complete rewriting of their understanding of existence. The people learned that they were not the last of humanity, but a hated minority, that the rest of the world saw them as devils, that their ancestors had committed terrible acts. The walls which they had considered sacred protection were revealed to be a prison. The Titans were not mindless monsters, but victims. Other Eldians transformed against their will, with Wall Maria retaken and the truth revealed. The Survey Corps began exploring beyond the walls with new purpose. They reached the coast, and for the first time in a century, people from Paradise saw the ocean. For Armin, who had always dreamed of seeing the sea, it was a moment of joy. For Eren, staring across the water toward the land where their enemies lived, it was something else. He asked Armin if they would finally be free once they killed everyone on the other side. The question disturbed everyone who heard it. The Survey Corps spent the next year investigating and preparing. They found that Marley had established a small base on Paradise. Left by Zeke's forces, this base contained technology and information about the outside world. Most importantly, they found a way to communicate with the outside world through contacts established via this base. They learned that the nation of Hizuru still remembered its ancient alliance with Eldia. An ambassador from Hizuru, a woman named Kiyomi Azumabito, traveled to Paradise. She revealed that Mikasa Ackerman was a descendant of the Azumabito clan, making her the last surviving member of Hizuru's ruling shogun bloodline. Kiyomi proposed an alliance. Hizuru would help Paradise develop economically and technologically in exchange for exclusive trading rights to the island's natural resources, particularly the fossil fuels. that Marley had originally coveted. The catch was that Paradise needed time to catch up to the rest of the world's technological level, and that time would be bought through the threat of the rumbling. Queen Historia would need to inherit the Beast Titan from Zeke, who had less than a year left before the 13-year curse ended his life. She would then produce children who would inherit the Beast Titan after her maintaining the royal family's ability to control the Founding Titan. Additionally, the Founding Titan would need to be passed down through generations, creating a cycle where the royal family and loyal subjects constantly consumed each other to maintain power. It was a grim mirror of the system that had maintained Eldian power for 2,000 years. Eren rejected this plan. He had seen his father's memories, understood the horror of forcing children to consume their parents, of shortening lives to 13 years through inherited curses. He particularly refused to accept Historia, his friend, being forced into this cycle. But he kept these objections private, playing along while he formulated his own ideas. The years following the discovery of the basement and the revelation of the outside world marked a period of desperate diplomatic efforts and growing tension. Queen Historia's government, advised by Commander Hangij and the surviving Survey Corps leadership, understood that Paradise faced an existential crisis. The entire world believed them to be devils, descendants of oppressors who had terrorized humanity for 2,000 years. Simply revealing the truth about their situation would not be enough to overcome centuries of propaganda and genuine historical grievances. They needed allies, trade partners, nations willing to vouch for them in international forums. The only nation that had shown any willingness to engage with Paradise was Hizuru, and even that relationship came with strings attached. Kiyomi Azumabito, the Hizuru envoy, presented her nation's proposal with careful diplomatic language, but the underlying calculation was clear. Hizuru would help Paradise modernize its economy and military in exchange for exclusive rights to the island's natural resources, particularly the fossil fuels that lay beneath the ground. Hizuru would also serve as Paradise's advocate in international negotiations, using its influence to convince other nations that the Eldians on the island posed no threat. The catch was time. Paradise needed at least 50 years to catch up technologically with the rest of the world. 50 years during which they would be vulnerable to attack. The only thing preventing immediate invasion was the threat of the rumbling, and maintaining that threat required keeping the Founding Titan within the royal bloodline. This created an uncomfortable dilemma. Historia would need to inherit a Titan power, specifically Zeke's Beast Titan, so that she could serve as the royal blood component necessary to activate the Founding Titan's full abilities. She would then need to produce as many children as possible, creating a line of inheritors who would maintain this capability across generations. Each inheritor would live only 13 years after gaining the power, condemned by the curse of Ymir to die young. It was a system that required sacrificing the royal family repeatedly, generation after generation, turning Historia and her descendants into breeding stock, whose only purpose was maintaining the deterrent that kept Paradise safe. Eren had seen his father's memories, had experienced through inherited recollection what it meant to be forced to consume a parent, to carry the guilt of survival at such a cost. He understood viscerally the horror of the 13-year curse, the way it compressed an entire human life into a fraction of its natural span. He had watched through Grisha's eyes as his father approached his death, knowing he would force his own son to eat him, understanding that this was necessary, but finding no comfort in necessity. The idea of condemning Historia to this fate, of creating a system where her children would be raised, knowing their mother would die when they were still young, where those children would then be forced to continue the cycle, was intolerable to Eren. But he kept these objections private, nodding along with the plans, while he considered alternatives that he shared with no one. A diplomatic mission was organized for the following year. The world's nations had called an international conference in Marley to discuss the Eldian question and to coordinate responses to the potential threat from Paradise. Officially, the conference would address global security concerns related to Titan powers and propose solutions for managing Eldian populations. Unofficially, it was an opportunity for world leaders to discuss their plans for invading Paradise before the island could become a genuine military threat. Hangij, now formally the commander of the Survey Corps, led the Paradis delegation. Accompanying her were several Survey Corps members, including Eren and Mikasa and Armin, Connie, Sasha, and Jean. They would travel to Marley as observers, gauging international sentiment, while Hizuru's representatives attempted to negotiate on their behalf. The journey to Marley was the first time any of them had left the island since the walls fell. They traveled by ship, crossing the ocean that Armin had always dreamed of seeing. The voyage took weeks, giving them time to observe the world beyond their isolated homeland. They saw commercial vessels from multiple nations, flying flags they did not recognize. They passed islands populated by people who knew nothing of Titans or walls, who lived ordinary lives in the global economy. They saw ports where ships loaded cargo bound for markets across the world, evidence of a trade network that Paradis had been excluded from. For a century, the scale of the world, the sheer number of people living lives completely disconnected from Titan warfare, drove home how small and isolated Paradis truly was. They arrived in Liberio, the Eldian internment zone in Marley, and for the first time the Survey Corps members saw how Eldians lived outside Paradis. The internment zone was a ghetto surrounded by walls and checkpoints. Eldian residents required to wear armbands marking their ethnicity, their movements restricted to specific hours and locations. The living conditions were cramped and poor, families sharing small apartments in buildings that showed decades of deferred maintenance. Yet, despite these conditions, the technology was far beyond anything on Paradis. Electric lights illuminated the streets, trains carried passengers and cargo, newspapers reported on global events. The Eldians here had cars and telephones and cameras, access to medicines and consumer goods that did not exist behind the walls. It was a strange contrast, oppression combined with modernity. People who were hated and restricted, but still participants in an industrial civilization. The Survey Corps members moved through Liberio in disguise, pretending to be returning Eldian workers or refugees. They needed to understand this place, to see how Eldians outside the walls survived, to gauge the depth of the hatred against their people. What they discovered was worse than they had imagined. Children in Marley were taught from their first days in school that Eldians were devils, that they had committed unspeakable atrocities during their empire's reign, that they carried in their blood the capacity to become monsters. The propaganda was not subtle. Textbooks showed illustrations of monstrous titans devouring innocent people, always with Eldian faces visible in the background. The Eldians in the internment zone had internalized much of this hatred, teaching their own children to be grateful for Marley's mercy in allowing them to live at all, encouraging them to join the warrior program as a way to prove their loyalty and earn better treatment for their families. During their time in Liberio, the Survey Corps attended public events and observed daily life, gathering intelligence about Marleyan military capabilities and social attitudes. They visited museums that displayed Eldian artifacts, exhibits that presented the history of Titan warfare from the perspective of its victims. The museums showed mass graves, preserved ruins of cities destroyed by Titans, testimonies from survivors of Eldian conquest. The history was not false. The Eldian Empire had committed the acts described, but the presentation left no room for nuance or context. No acknowledgement that the Eldians on Paradis were not the same people who had built that empire. No recognition that punishing descendants for ancestral sins might itself be unjust. Eren, walking through these exhibits, experienced something that separated him from his companions. While Armin and the others saw tragic history and contemplated the complexity of inherited guilt, Eren saw justification for what he was increasingly convinced would be necessary. He watched Eldian children in the zone being taught to hate themselves, saw the walls and checkpoints that restricted their movements, heard Marleyan citizens casually discuss plans to exterminate everyone on Paradis. He understood that no amount of diplomacy would change the fundamental reality. The world wanted his people dead, and it had the power to make that wish reality. The international conference proceeded. As Hizuru had warned, it would representatives from dozens of nations gather to discuss the threat posed by Paradis Island. Hizuru's delegates attempted to argue that Paradis posed no aggressive threat, that the island's inhabitants simply wanted to be left in peace. that given time they could become productive members of the international community. These arguments were met with skepticism, bordering on hostility. One after another, national representatives stood to declare that they could not risk allowing a population of Eldians to develop military capability, that the threat of the rumbling was itself an act of aggression, that the only acceptable solution was preventive military action to neutralize the threat before it could materialize. Technology had advanced to the point where nations believed they could successfully attack Paradise. They had developed aircraft that could potentially bomb targets on the island, artillery that could damage the walls, naval vessels that could transport invasion forces. A global alliance was forming specifically to address the Eldian question. Nations that had no other common interests, uniting around the shared goal of eliminating Paradise before the rumbling could be activated. The delegates spoke openly about invasion timetables, about acceptable casualty rates, about post-conflict plans for the island's resources. They discussed these plans knowing that Eldians were present, speaking without shame about genocide, because they genuinely believed it was necessary for global security. Willie Tybur, the head of the Tybur family and holder of the Warhammer Titan, gave a public address during the conference that crystallized global sentiment. Tybur was a master orator, someone who understood how to speak to both elite audiences and common people. He stood on a stage before thousands of attendees, his speech broadcast through new recording technology to audiences across Marley and allied nations. Tybur told the truth about Karl Fritz's vow renouncing war, revealing that the king who had retreated to Paradise had bound his successors to pacifism, that the threat of the rumbling had been an empty bluff for the past century. This revelation should have eased tensions, should have removed the primary justification for fearing Paradise. Instead, Tybur used it to argue for immediate action. He explained that while the royal family on Paradise was still bound by the vow, a new threat had emerged. Eren Yeager, who possessed the founding Titan but was not of royal blood, might have found a way to access the founder's power without submitting to the vow. If Eren succeeded, he could activate the rumbling without the pacifist restrictions that had constrained previous founding Titan holders. The world, Tybur argued, had a brief window to act. They needed to invade Paradise, secure the founding Titan, and eliminate the threat before Eren could unlock its full potential. Tybur declared war on Paradise in front of the assembled representatives, receiving thunderous applause. What neither Tybur nor the audience knew was that Eren was present. He had infiltrated the area weeks earlier, living among the Eldian population in Liberia, waiting for exactly this moment. Eren had sent letters to the Survey Corps members, telling them where he was and what he planned. The letters were cryptic, providing just enough information for them to find him, but not enough to reveal his full intentions. When they finally located Eren, he was living in a basement apartment among wounded Eldian soldiers, men who had returned from Marley's recent wars in the Middle East. Eren had grown his hair, long appeared gaunt and exhausted, his eyes carrying an intensity that disturbed even those who had known him for years. Eren told them that everything was proceeding according to plan, though he would not explain what plan he meant. He told them to trust him, that he would protect Paradise, that he knew what needed to be done. Armin and Mikasa pressed him for details, trying to understand what he intended, but Eren remained deliberately vague. He spoke in ways that made them uncomfortable, referencing future events, as if they had already happened, talking about freedom and necessity in the same breath. The Survey Corps members realized that Eren was going to do something during Tybur's speech, something that would likely provoke a military response, but they did not know what exactly or how to stop him without causing an international incident themselves. During this time, Eren had also made contact with Zeke, his half-brother, whom he had never truly known. The meeting between the brothers was arranged through intermediaries, facilitated by Zeke's follower Yelena, a Marleyan soldier who had converted to belief in Eldian liberation after being captured by Zeke during one of Marley's wars. Yelena had come to view Zeke as something approaching a savior, someone with the vision and power to end the suffering of all Eldians. She served as a messenger between the brothers, carrying letters and arranging for secret communications through the limited channels available. Zeke's plan, which he revealed to Eren during their clandestine meetings, was radical and born from profound trauma. Zeke had grown up crushed under the weight of his father's expectations, forced to become a tool in the Eldian restorationist movement before he was old enough to understand what that meant. His childhood had been defined by pressure, disappointment, and the constant fear that his inadequacy would doom everyone who depended on him. Tom Cassaver, the man who had shown Zeke genuine kindness, had taught him about the history of Eldian suffering, about how the cycle of hatred and violence perpetuated itself across generations. Cassaver had once told Zeke that if Eldians had never been born, none of this suffering would exist. That idea had taken root in Zeke's mind and grown into a comprehensive philosophy. Zeke's solution was what he called the euthanasia plan. Though he preferred terms like liberation or salvation, the plan was straightforward in concept. Use the founding Titan's power to alter the biology of all subjects of Ymir, making them incapable of reproducing. Eldians would live out their natural lives, but they would have no children. Within one generation, roughly a century, the entire Eldian population would die of old age, and the subjects of Ymir would cease to exist. Without Eldians, there could be no Titans without Titans. There would be no reason for the world to fear or hate Eldians. The remaining Eldians would live peaceful lives, knowing that their deaths would finally end 2,000 years of violence and persecution. To Zeke, this was the most compassionate solution available. A military response to the world's aggression would kill billions and leave the fundamental problem unsolved. Doing nothing would result in Paradise being invaded and exterminated. Compromises and diplomatic solutions required trust that Zeke believed impossible. Generations of careful negotiation that might fail at any point. But sterilization would definitively solve the problem. The world would have no reason to attack Paradise if they knew the Eldian population was aging out of existence. Eldians could live their remaining years in peace, possibly even gaining sympathy from other nations once the threat was permanently removed. The cost was that no Eldian child would ever be born again. But Zeke viewed that as mercy rather than tragedy. Why bring children into a world that hated them for their blood? Why perpetuate suffering across another generation when you could end it permanently? Zeke presented this plan to Eren as the brothers established tentative contact, explaining his reasoning with the passion of someone who had spent years refining his philosophy. He told Eren about their father, about Grisha's obsession with restoring Eldia, about how that obsession had destroyed Zeke's childhood and led to Dina's transformation into a Titan. He told Eren that they were both victims of their father's ambitions, both used as tools for goals they had not chosen. The euthanasia plan, Zeke argued, would finally free them from that cycle. No more children sacrificed for abstract causes, no more generations inheriting their parents' wars, just peace and a gentle ending. Eren appeared to accept this plan. He told Zeke that he understood, that he agreed with the logic, that he would work with his brother to make it happen. To activate the Founding Titan's full power required two components: the Founding Titan itself, which Eren possessed, and someone of royal blood making physical contact with the Founding Titan holder. Zeke, as a son of Dina Fritz, carried royal blood, despite not being a member of the main Fritz line. If Eren and Zeke touched while Eren was in Titan form, the Founding Titan would awaken completely, allowing them to command Ymir and the paths, to remake the biology of all subjects of Ymir. The plan required careful coordination, and it required bringing Zeke to Paradise. But Eren agreed to make it happen. What Zeke did not realize was that Eren had no intention of allowing the euthanasia plan to proceed. Eren's true thoughts and motivations remained hidden, even from those closest to him. He had seen something through the attack. Titan's unusual relationship with time had experienced memories from his own future that showed him where everything was heading. He knew what choices he would make because he had already experienced making them, creating a paradox that left him both determined and resigned. The euthanasia plan was not acceptable to Eren for reasons both philosophical and personal. He refused to accept that Eldians deserved to disappear, refused to believe that Historia should be sacrificed, or that Eldian children should never be born. But more than that, Eren had seen a path to what he believed was true freedom, and that path required the rumbling. Willie Tyburn's speech, declaring war on Paradise in front of the assembled world leaders, became the moment when Eren's hidden plan revealed itself. The speech took place in an open plaza in Liberio, built specifically for this public event. Thousands attended in person, while the speech was broadcast to millions more. Tybur stood on an elevated stage, speaking with theatrical flair, telling the assembled crowd about Eldia's crimes, about Karl Fritz's vow, about the new threat emerging from Paradise. As Tybur spoke about Eren Yeager, describing him as a devil who threatened the entire world, Eren himself sat in a basement apartment directly beneath the plaza, listening to his own demonization through the floor. When Tybur reached the climax of his speech, formally declaring war and calling for international cooperation to eliminate the Paradise threat, Eren made his move. He transformed into the Attack Titan, his Titan form erupting from the basement and emerging directly beneath the stage where Tybur stood. The transformation's explosive force destroyed the surrounding building, sending debris flying in all directions, killing dozens of civilians and military personnel instantly. Eren's Titan rose through the floor of the plaza, his appearance causing instant panic among the assembled crowd. People scattered, screaming, trampling each other in their rush to escape. Military personnel attempted to organize a response, but the surprise was total. Willy Tybur, in his final moments, transformed into the Warhammer Titan, his sister who had actually been the true inheritor of the power, while Willy served as the public face, emerged from the crowd and activated her Titan form. The Warhammer appeared as a white humanoid figure, immediately manifesting an enormous hammer from hardened material. She struck at Eren's Titan, the hammer's impact powerful enough to crater the ground and crush stone buildings. Eren dodged, his Attack Titan form moving with practiced agility. But the Warhammer was a dangerous opponent. She could create weapons and structures at will, lances shooting from the ground to pierce his body, cables wrapping around his limbs, constant attacks from multiple angles. The battle devastated the plaza and surrounding buildings. Eren's regeneration allowed him to recover from wounds that would incapacitate lesser shifters, but the Warhammer's crystal body meant he could not land a decisive blow. She had encased her true body in a crystal shell and was operating the Titan remotely through a cable, making it impossible to defeat the Warhammer by destroying the visible Titan body. Eren would need to find the crystal and break through it, a task that should have been impossible. But Eren was not fighting alone. The Survey Corps, recognizing that Eren had committed them to battle, whether they agreed or not, joined the fight. Mikasa and Armin and Jean, Connie and Sasha used their ODM gear to attack Marleyan military positions, targeting artillery and troop formations that were attempting to surround Eren's Titan. They moved through the chaos of the destroyed plaza, their years of Titan combat experience making them far more effective than Marleyan soldiers who had trained primarily for conventional warfare. Sasha provided covering fire with her rifle, picking off officers and communications personnel. Jean and Connie destroyed supply lines and weapon emplacements. Armin used his tactical mind to identify key positions and coordinate the others. But the cost was immediately apparent. Marleyan forces, once they recovered from the initial shock, returned fire with modern weaponry. Machine guns, artillery, and concentrated rifle fire created kill zones that even ODM gear could not safely navigate. The Survey Corps members found themselves fighting not just Titans but an industrial military force. With overwhelming numerical superiority, they held out, buying time for Eren to defeat the Warhammer. But the situation was deteriorating rapidly. Then the Jaw Titan appeared. Porco Galliard, the current inheritor of the Jaw's power, had been attending the festival and transformed to engage Eren. The Jaw was fast and vicious, its enhanced teeth capable of biting through the Attack Titan's flesh. Porco attacked from Eren's blind spots, tearing chunks from the Attack Titan's body, creating openings for the Warhammer to exploit. Eren found himself fighting two Titan shifters while surrounded by conventional forces, the battle turning against him despite his strength. Eren's plan accounted for this. He had arranged for support, and that support arrived in the form of the Survey Corps airship, a captured Marleyan vessel that descended over the plaza and deployed additional forces. More significantly, Zeke appeared in his beast Titan form, the massive ape-like creature standing over 17 meters, tall and covered in fur, positioned itself on top of nearby buildings and began throwing debris at Marleyan positions. Zeke's throwing accuracy was legendary, each projectile striking with artillery-like precision. He cleared entire streets with volleys of improvised ammunition, broken cobblestones, and building fragments turned into lethal projectiles that destroyed Marleyan emplacements and scattered troops. The Warhammer's crystal was buried underground, the cable connecting it to the visible Titan body running beneath the plaza's surface. Eren could not reach it alone, but he did not need to. He deliberately allowed the Jaw Titan to bite into his Titan's neck, bringing Porco close. Then Eren used the hardening ability he had gained through training, manifesting spikes that impaled the Jaw Titan and pinned it in place. With Porco trapped, Eren forced the Jaw Titan's teeth to bite down on the Warhammer's crystal. The Jaw's teeth, capable of breaking through any material, cracked the crystal shell. Eren reached into the crack and consumed the Warhammer Titan's inheritor, gaining yet another power. The raid on Liberio lasted only minutes, but killed hundreds, including many civilians who had simply attended what they thought would be a political speech. Eren and the Survey Corps retreated to the airship pursued by Marleyan military forces, but managing to escape. Gabi Braun, a young warrior candidate, and Falco Grice, another candidate, had managed to board the airship in the chaos. Gabi, enraged by what she had witnessed, shot and killed Sasha Blaus, one of the Survey Corps members, before she and Falco were subdued. The raid accomplished multiple objectives for Eren. He had eliminated Willie Tybur, the man who was rallying global opposition to Paradise. He had gained the Warhammer Titan's abilities, adding to his already formidable power. Most importantly, he had forced Marley and the world into immediate military response, accelerating the timetable for conflict. The world could no longer debate whether to act against Paradise. Eren had attacked their homeland, killed their citizens, proven himself to be exactly the threat they had feared. Now they would marshal their forces for invasion, and that invasion would provide the justification Eren needed for what came next. Eren was brought back to Paradise, but his return did not resolve the crisis his actions had created. It intensified divisions within Paradise society and military that had been growing since the truth about the outside world became public. The population was split between those who supported Eren's aggressive approach and those who sought diplomatic solutions. The Survey Corps leadership, including Hangin, and those loyal to her, believed that Eren had acted recklessly, that his attack on Liberio had eliminated any possibility of peaceful coexistence with the outside world, that his willingness to kill civilians showed a dangerous disregard for the moral principles that should guide their actions. But a significant portion of the population, particularly among common citizens and lower-ranking military personnel, saw Eren as a hero who had struck back against a world that wanted them dead. This pro-Eren faction, which came to be known as the Yeagerists, formed around the belief that strength and determination were the only things that could save Paradise. They argued that the world had already decided on genocide, that diplomacy was a fantasy that ignored reality, that the only question was whether Eldians would die passively or fight back with everything they had. The Yeagerists viewed Eren's actions in Liberio not as a moral failing, but as necessary courage, the willingness to do what weak-willed leaders would not. They pointed out that every diplomatic overture had been rejected, that even Hizuru's support was conditional and self-interested, that no nation had offered genuine alliance or protection. The Yeagerists' leader, in practical terms, was a soldier named Flock Forster. Flock had been part of the doomed charge that Commander Erwin led against the Beast Titan during the Battle of Shiganshina. He had been one of the only survivors of that charge, carried back barely alive, and the experience had transformed him. Flock had watched hundreds of his comrades die for what seemed like a futile gesture, had seen the idealism of the Survey Corps result in massive casualties for minimal gain. When the choice came to save either Erwin or Armin with the final Titan injection, Flock had argued for saving Erwin, believing that the hardened commander was necessary for humanity's survival. When Captain Levi chose Armin instead, Flock felt that sentimentality had overruled practical necessity. Flock's worldview hardened into a philosophy that prioritized Paradise's survival above all other considerations. He argued that the world had forced this situation on them, that they were responding to genocide with self-defense, that moral qualms were a luxury they could not afford. When Eren returned from Liberio, Flock saw in him someone who shared this perspective, someone willing to act while others hesitated. Flock began organizing supporters, initially just informal discussion groups among soldiers who expressed frustration with the government's indecisiveness. But as tensions grew and Marley's invasion fleet approached, the Yeagerists became a significant political force. The government's response to Eren's actions was to imprison him. He was held in a cell beneath military headquarters, officially for insubordination and unauthorized military action. The plan was to hold him until leadership could decide how to proceed, how to manage both the external threat from Marley and the internal division Eren's actions had created. But imprisoning Eren, while symbolically important for establishing government authority, did nothing to solve the fundamental problems facing Paradise. Marley was organizing a coalition invasion force. The rest of the world was contributing ships, soldiers, and resources to what they saw. Paradise had months at best before that force arrived, and the island's military capabilities were insufficient to repel a determined assault by modern forces. The Yeagerists, believing that Eren represented Paradise's only real hope for survival, began planning to free him. Flock coordinated with sympathetic soldiers, identifying those who shared their perspective or could be persuaded to support Eren. The movement included members of all three military branches, though it was strongest among those who had fought on the front lines and seen friends die to Titan attacks. These soldiers had limited patience for political nuance. They knew that invasion was coming, they believed Eren could stop it, and they were willing to take drastic action to ensure he had that opportunity. The internal situation deteriorated further when it became clear that some members of the military leadership had been working with Zeke, coordinating with him to bring about the euthanasia plan. Zeke had supporters in Paradise, soldiers who had been contacted by Yelena and convinced that sterilization was the most humane solution available. These supporters, operating in secret, had infiltrated key positions and were working to ensure that Eren and Zeke could make contact. The revelation of this conspiracy created further paranoia and division. Who could be trusted? Which soldiers were working for Zeke's plan? Which ones supported Eren? Which ones remained loyal to the official government? Tensions reached a breaking point when the Yeagerists staged their operation to free Eren. They coordinated a simultaneous assault on multiple government facilities, timing their action to coincide with increased security concerns about the approaching Marleyan fleet. Flock's forces overwhelmed the guards at Eren's holding facility, killed officers who attempted to stop them, and released Eren from his cell. The violence shocked many, demonstrating that the Yeagerists were willing to kill fellow Eldians to achieve their goals. But for the Yeagerists, this was justified as self-defense against leaders who would sacrifice Paradise rather than take necessary but difficult action. With Eren free, the Yeagerists secured key government buildings and military installations. They did not have unanimous military support. Many soldiers remained loyal to the official command structure, but they had enough backing to prevent immediate suppression. Paradis found itself in a state of internal conflict just as external invasion loomed. The military divided, the government's authority challenged, different factions preparing for civil war while a foreign enemy approached their shores. Queen Historia, watching these events unfold, found herself in an impossible position. She was the legitimate ruler, but her power derived largely from the support of the military and the people's belief in legitimate governance. If the military was split and a significant portion of the population supported the Yeagerists, her authority to command obedience was limited. She could order the Yeagerists suppressed, but that might trigger outright civil war. She could try to negotiate, but Eren and Flock were not interested in compromise. The situation was spiraling beyond anyone's control. Different forces moving toward confrontation because no one could find a path that satisfied all parties. Heng, now responsible for the Survey Corps, in this chaos attempted to maintain some kind of order and prepare for both the external and internal threats. But her forces were divided, some siding with the Yeagerists, others remaining loyal but uncertain how to proceed. The core had been built around idealism and the pursuit of freedom, but now they faced the question of what freedom meant when different groups wanted incompatible things. Was freedom the right to defend yourself by any means necessary, even genocide? Was it the right to choose your own fate, even if that choice led to your people's extinction? These philosophical questions had immediate practical implications as Marley's invasion force drew closer each day. Marley launched its invasion, sending Zeke with a military force to either capture the founding Titan or destroy it before Eren could activate the rumbling. The battle that followed saw Zeke and Eren finally make physical contact. When Zeke caught Eren's severed head after Gabby had shot it off with an anti-Titan rifle, the moment of contact, the required trigger for activating the founding Titan's full power, transported both brothers into the paths, the realm that existed outside normal time and space where Ymir Fritz had been bound for 2,000 years. The paths manifested as an infinite desert beneath a starless sky, the ground composed of pale sand that crunched beneath their feet. In the center of this wasteland stood an enormous tree, its trunk wider than mountains, its branches stretching into impossible distances. The tree's structure resembled the branching pathways of nerves or blood vessels, an organic network frozen in vegetative form. This was the coordinate, the central point from which all Eldian lives branched, the place where Ymir had constructed every Titan that had ever existed, grain by grain building bodies in response to the commands of the royal family. Eren and Zeke materialized as their human forms standing in this desert that was simultaneously nowhere and everywhere, existing in a moment that was both instantaneous and eternal. Time in the paths did not flow the same way as in the physical world. Hours or even years could pass here while only seconds elapsed outside. Zeke understood this, had learned about it from his mentor Tom Casaver, and he intended to use the time differential to convince Eren of the euthanasia plan's necessity. If Eren could be shown the truth, if he could be made to understand what their father Grisha had really been, perhaps he would willingly accept sterilization as the kindest option. Zeke began by showing Eren their father's memories, walking Eren through the events of Grisha's life. In the paths, they could access these memories, directly experiencing them, as if living through them. They watched Grisha's childhood in Liberio, saw his sister face death, experienced his recruitment into the Eldian restorationists. They witnessed Grisha's marriage to Dina Fritz and the birth of Zeke, but most importantly, they observed Grisha's behavior as a father, the way he pushed Zeke, relentlessly filling the child's head with ideology and expectations that no child should carry. Zeke wanted Eren to see what he had seen, to understand that Grisha was a broken man who used his children as tools for his obsessions. Zeke showed Eren the moments of coldness, the times Grisha prioritized the mission over his son's emotional needs, the way he treated Zeke as a future weapon, rather than a child who needed love and guidance. Zeke's argument was that both he and Eren had been victimized by their father, that the cycle of abuse and instrumentalization was what needed to end that. By preventing future Eldian births, they would prevent future children from being used as Grisha had used them. But as they walked through Grisha's memories together, something unexpected occurred. When they reached the point where Grisha arrived on Paradise, when he met Carla, and eventually fathered Eren, the memories did not show what Zeke expected. Grisha had learned from his mistakes with Zeke, his relationship with Eren, while still carrying the weight of his mission, and the knowledge he could not share was fundamentally different. Grisha let Eren be a child. He played with him, showed affection, supported his dreams, even when they conflicted with practical safety. When Eren wanted to join the Survey Corps, when he talked about seeing the world beyond the walls, Grisha encouraged these ambitions, rather than crushing them to serve predetermined goals. The night before Wall Maria fell, Grisha had decided to delay his mission indefinitely. He had lived among the people behind the walls for years, built a medical practice, created a new family, and he no longer felt the certainty that had driven him in his youth. Perhaps the mission was wrong. Perhaps forcing the founding Titan from the Rice family and awakening the Eldians behind the walls to the outside world's hatred would cause more suffering than it prevented. Grisha went to the Reis family's chapel, where the founding Titan would be transferred to the next inheritor, intending to observe and make a final decision about whether to intervene. But what happened in that chapel The events that led to Grisha murdering most of the Rice family and stealing the founding Titan showed a truth that shattered Zeke's understanding of history. As Eren and Zeke watched through Grisha's eyes, they saw Eren himself appear in the chapel. Visible to Grisha through the attack, Titan's unusual ability to send memories backward through time. The Eren from the future, the Eren who already knew how everything would unfold, spoke to Grisha through the memory, urging him to act, to kill the Rice family, to take the founding Titan. Grisha hesitated, pleading with his future son to explain why this horror was necessary. Eren from the future insisted, showing Grisha visions of what would happen if he failed to act, manipulating his father through the very mechanism that allowed attack Titan inheritors to see the future. Zeke watched in horror as he realized the truth. Grisha had not wanted to massacre the Rice family. He had been manipulated into it by Eren, by his own son, using time paradox as a weapon. Everything Zeke thought he understood about their father, about the cycle of violence and abuse, was undermined by this revelation. Grisha had been a victim of Eren's manipulations, just as much as Zeke had been a victim of Grisha's ideology. But worse than that, the revelation meant that Eren had always intended to activate the rumbling, that he had been working toward this goal across timelines, that Zeke's euthanasia plan had never had any chance of success because Eren was several steps ahead. Eren confirmed this by explaining his true intentions. He had never supported the euthanasia plan. He had pretended to cooperate to gain access to the founding Titan's power, using Zeke's royal blood to bypass the restrictions that would normally prevent him from commanding Ymir. Eren told Zeke that he would not accept a plan that required Historia to be sacrificed, that forced Eldian children to never be born, that surrendered to the world's hatred rather than fighting back. Eren's vision of freedom required that Eldians be able to live without fear, to have children without condemning them to persecution, to exist as full human beings rather than marked devils waiting to die out. But to achieve that freedom, Eren argued, required removing the threat, and the threat was the entire rest of the world. Billions of people whose cultures and governments were built on anti-Eldian hatred, whose very existence represented a continuing danger to Paradise. Eren had seen, through the attacked Titan's memories, that partial measures would not work, that limited applications of the rumbling would only buy time, that generations of his descendants would fight the same battles against the same hatreds. The only way to truly free Eldians from this cycle was to eliminate everyone who threatened them, to activate the full rumbling and flatten the entire world beyond Paradise. Zeke, desperate to stop this, tried to use his royal blood to command Ymir directly. In the paths, Ymir Fritz herself appeared, a small girl covered in dirt and chains, her eyes empty of any apparent will. She had been building Titans here for 2,000 years, following the commands of the royal family, her consciousness bound to servitude, even in death. Zeke ordered her to implement the euthanasia plan, to alter the biology of all subjects of Ymir and make them unable to reproduce. Ymir began moving to comply, her body responding automatically to royal command as it had for millennia. But then Eren spoke to Ymir, directly addressing her not as a tool or slave, but as a person. He told her that she had been waiting for 2,000 years, not for someone to give her the right orders, but for someone to free her from the need to follow orders at all. He told her that she was not a slave, that she had never been a slave in the sense of lacking will or consciousness, but that she had been trapped by her own inability to reject King Fritz's commands. She had loved Fritz, despite his cruelty, had defined her entire existence through serving him, and that psychological bondage had persisted long after physical death. Eren walked toward Ymir through the infinite desert, approaching the girl who held the power to reshape reality for millions of people. He told her that she could choose. She could follow the royal family's commands as she always had, implementing Zeke's sterilization plan, continuing the pattern of obedience that had defined her existence. Or she could choose to be free, to exercise her own will, to decide for herself what should happen. He told her that he understood her pain, her rage, her desire for something more than endless servitude. He told her that he would give her what she wanted, an ending, a release, a chance to finally destroy the world that had enslaved her. and all her descendants. Ymir's chains, visible manifestations of her psychological bondage, began to crack. Her empty eyes focused on Eren, seeing perhaps for the first time in 2,000 years someone who addressed her as an equal rather than a tool. She made her choice. The chains shattered, falling away from her body in fragments that dissolved into the path's sand. Ymir walked toward Eren, away from Zeke, rejecting royal authority for the first time in her long existence. She gave her power to Eren, severing the royal family's exclusive control over the founding Titan. The ground began to shake. In the physical world where only seconds had passed during the extended time in the paths, massive changes began occurring. The walls around Paradise started to crumble. The hardening that had kept the colossal titans frozen for a century began falling away like brittle skin. Millions of these 60-meter giants, each one capable of devastating entire cities, awakened from their hibernation. They began moving, their footsteps registering on seismic equipment across the continent, their initial steps toward the ocean marking the beginning of the rumbling. Eren's founding Titan form emerged from his physical body, a skeletal horror, unlike any Titan that had existed before. His ribcage extended like the legs of some monstrous insect, each rib longer than a building supporting a structure that stretched hundreds of meters. His spine formed the central column of this nightmarish form, with his head visible at the front, exposed flesh and bone creating a visage of pure horror. This was not a body built for fighting other titans, or for any practical combat purpose. It was a form designed solely to carry out the rumbling, to coordinate and command the millions of colossal titans as they marched to destroy everything beyond the island. Through the paths, Eren sent a message to all subjects of Ymir, his words appearing directly in their consciousnesses regardless of where they were physically located. He told them what was happening, explained that he had activated the rumbling, that the millions of colossal titans from the walls were now marching to flatten the entire world. He declared that every nation, every culture, every person beyond Paradise would be trampled beneath the Titan's feet, that he would not stop until all life beyond the island was extinct. He justified this as necessary for Paradise's freedom, as the only way to ensure that Eldians could live without fear of genocide. Some who heard this message in the paths felt relief, believing that Eren would save them from their enemies. Others felt horror at the scale of the destruction he promised. But regardless of how they felt, they could not stop what had begun. The rumbling was now in motion. Millions of colossal titans walking across the ocean floor toward the mainland, and Eren possessed the full power of the founding Titan to direct them and protect them from any force that might attempt to stop the march. The walls crumbled. The colossal titans that had formed the walls for 100 years awakened, hardening, falling away from their bodies. Millions of these massive titans began marching. Their destination was the entire world beyond Paradise. Eren's founding Titan form emerged, a skeletal horror, hundreds of meters long, ribcage extending like the legs of some massive insect, his head visible at the front of the structure. He sent a message through the paths to all subjects of Ymir, telling them what was happening. He would use the rumbling to destroy all life beyond the island, to ensure that no one could ever threaten Paradise again. The walls crumbled. The colossal titans that had formed the walls for 100 years awakened, hardening, falling away from their bodies. Millions of these massive titans began marching. Their destination was the entire world beyond Paradise. Eren's founding Titan form emerged, a skeletal horror, hundreds of meters long, his head visible at the front of the structure. He sent a message through the paths to all subjects of Ymir, telling them what was happening. He would use the rumbling to destroy all life beyond the island, to ensure that no one could ever threaten Paradise again. The colossal titans marched into the ocean, walking across the sea floor toward the mainland. They moved at a steady pace, each step covering dozens of meters, their collective movement registering on seismic equipment as far away as the opposite side of the continent. The ocean water around them turned to steam from the heat their bodies generated, creating massive columns of vapor that rose kilometers into the sky and were visible from the mainland coast. The first reports came from coastal observation posts, confused messages about impossible readings, about walls of steam approaching across the water, about something vast moving beneath the waves. Nations that had spent the previous months preparing for a coordinated invasion of Paradise now faced annihilation approaching their own shores. The Marleyan military, which had lost much of its Titan force and significant conventional capabilities in the raid on Liberio and subsequent battles, attempted to organize a defense. Artillery was positioned along the coast, naval vessels deployed, aircraft fueled and armed. But these preparations designed for attacking a fortified island proved useless against the reality of millions of colossal titans emerging from the ocean. The first colossal titans reached the Marleyan coast at dawn, the sun rising behind their massive forms and creating silhouettes that witnesses would remember for the rest of their brief lives. The titans walked onto the beach, their feet crushing everything beneath them, their heat igniting buildings and vegetation before they even made contact. Coastal cities were overwhelmed in minutes. A colossal titan's footstep was wider than most buildings, its weight sufficient to pulverize stone and steel, its presence turning entire city blocks into flattened ruins mixed with steaming corpses. The heat alone killed thousands before the titans physically reached them. The air temperature in areas where multiple colossal titans congregated rose to lethal levels exceeding what human bodies could survive. People attempting to evacuate found themselves cooking in the open air, their skin blistering and burning, their lungs searing from breathing superheated atmosphere. Those who sought shelter in buildings discovered that conventional structures offered no protection. The titans walked through cities like humans walking through tall grass, their legs knocking over buildings that stood in their path, their feet crushing anything that fell beneath them. The Marleyan military's attempts at resistance demonstrated both courage and futility. Artillery units fired shells at the approaching titans, scoring direct hits that tore chunks from titan flesh, but the wounds healed almost instantly, steam rising from the damage as tissue regenerated. Aircraft strafed the titans with machine gun fire and dropped bombs, achieving nothing except using up ammunition and fuel. Naval vessels fired their main guns, each impact powerful enough to destroy a conventional building, but merely inconveniencing the titans. A few titans fell when concentrated fire destroyed critical areas, but there were millions of titans, and they simply walked over or around the fallen. Eren's founding titan, moving at the center of the advancing horde, coordinated the march and protected the colossal titans from any concentrated attacks. Previous titan shifters, warriors from across 2,000 years of history, manifested in the paths and were given physical form to serve as Eren's army. These past inheritors of the 9 titans appeared on the battlefield, not as independent beings but as puppets controlled through the founding titans' power fighting, to defend the rumbling from any force that attempted to stop it. The destruction spread beyond the coastal regions within the first day. The colossal titans did not need to rest, did not require food or water, simply continued marching inland at their steady, inexorable pace. Refugees fled ahead of the advancing line, clogging roads and rail lines, carrying whatever possessions they could manage, abandoning everything else. The evacuation was chaotic and inadequate. Millions of people attempting to move simultaneously overwhelmed every system of transportation and logistics. Food supplies ran out, water became scarce. The social order began breaking down as desperation set in. Nations further from Marley received reports of the rumbling through telegraph and radio, messages that grew increasingly frantic as the scale of destruction became clear. Governments held emergency sessions, attempting to formulate responses to a threat that had never been seriously considered, despite Willy Tiber's warnings. Some nations attempted to send military forces to assist Marley, loading troops and equipment onto ships and trains. Others focused on domestic evacuation, trying to move their populations away from the rumbling's expected path. A few attempted diplomacy, sending desperate messages to Paradise, offering immediate surrender, promising never to threaten the island, pleading for the rumbling to stop. These pleas went unanswered. Eren had committed himself to complete genocide, to ensuring that no one beyond Paradise survived to threaten his people. The advance continued methodically, the colossal titans spreading out to cover maximum territory, ensuring that no region would be spared. They marched through farmland, crushing crops and irrigation systems, destroying the agricultural base that would be needed for any survivors to rebuild. They walked through cities and towns, flattening every structure, killing every person, leaving nothing but compressed ruins and the smell of burned flesh. The environmental impact was immediate and catastrophic. Forests ignited from the heat, creating firestorms that spread faster than people could flee. Rivers boiled where titans crossed them, killing aquatic life and contaminating water supplies downstream. The ash and smoke from burning cities and forests created a haze that darkened the sky, blocking sunlight and causing temperatures to drop even as the titans themselves generated intense localized heat. Wildlife died in massive numbers, either crushed directly by the titans or killed by the environmental destruction their passage caused. Some people, rather than fleeing, chose to face the rumbling on their own terms. They gathered with their families, held religious services, or simply waited quietly for the end. Others fought against the inevitable with whatever weapons they could find, throwing rocks and firing guns at the approaching titans in futile gestures of defiance. There were instances of extraordinary courage, parents shielding children even as they knew it was hopeless, strangers helping each other in the chaos, communities maintaining order and dignity even as death approached. But these moments of humanity occurred against a backdrop of unprecedented horror. The global death toll climbed into the millions within the first week, tens of millions by the second week. Entire nations were wiped from existence, their populations killed, their cities destroyed, their histories erased. Languages that had been spoken for thousands of years died with their final speakers. Cultural artifacts that had survived centuries were crushed beneath Titan feet. The diversity of human civilization, the accumulated knowledge and art and tradition of hundreds of distinct societies, was being systematically eliminated. The Survey Corps, including Armin and Mikasa and Jean, Connie, and others, refused to accept this outcome. They understood Eren's rage, his desire to protect Paradise, but they could not stand by while he committed global genocide. The moral calculus was impossible, but unavoidable. Allowing the rumbling to continue meant complicity in the deaths of billions of innocent people, most of whom had never personally threatened Paradise, who were simply born into societies built on anti-Eldian prejudice. Stopping Eren meant betraying their homeland and possibly condemning Paradise to eventual invasion and extermination. There was no choice that did not require immense sacrifice and moral compromise. Armin, as the inheritor of the colossal titan and the strategic mind of their group, articulated the position that ultimately drove their decision. He argued that they could not control what the world would do after stopping Eren, could not guarantee that diplomacy would succeed where it had previously failed, but they could control their own actions, could choose to do what they believed was right, even if it cost them everything. Allowing genocide to proceed, even genocide committed to protect people they loved, would make them complicit in something they knew was fundamentally wrong. They would have to try to stop Eren, even if that meant fighting against their own nation, even if it meant dying in the attempt. Mikasa's position was more conflicted. She loved Eren, had devoted her life to protecting him since the day he saved her from the kidnappers who murdered her parents. The idea of fighting against him, possibly killing him, went against everything her instincts demanded. But she had seen what Eren was becoming, had recognized that the boy she loved was choosing a path that would destroy him morally, even if he succeeded physically. She could not follow him to that destination, could not stand beside him while he murdered billions. Her choice to oppose Eren was an act of love as much as principle, an attempt to save him from himself, even if he could not be saved at all. Jean and Connie had both lost friends and comrades to Titan attacks, had every reason to hate the world that had created those Titans and sent them against Paradise. But they had also developed relationships with Eldians from Marley, had seen that people like Falco and even Gabby were not monsters, but children shaped by circumstances beyond their control. They recognized that the cycle of hatred that Eren sought to end through genocide could only truly be broken by refusing to perpetuate it, by choosing mercy even when revenge felt justified. They formed an alliance with their former enemies, a coalition that included Marleyan warriors and Paradise soldiers fighting side by side. Reiner Braun, the armored titan, had been their enemy during the Battle of Trost and the other early conflicts, responsible for countless deaths, including the breach of Wall Maria that had led to Eren's mother being killed. Yet Reiner had also been a child soldier, indoctrinated by Marley, forced to commit atrocities for the promise that his family might be spared from persecution. He hated himself for what he had done, suffered from psychological trauma that manifested as dissociative episodes and suicidal ideation. Joining the Alliance to stop Eren was his chance at redemption, his opportunity to save lives rather than take them. Annie Leonhardt, the female Titan, had killed many Survey Corps members during her mission to capture Eren years earlier. She had crystallized herself rather than face capture, spending years in suspended animation while the world changed around her. When she emerged from the crystal freed by the power of the founding Titan, disrupting all hardening, she found herself in a world on the brink of destruction. Annie had never believed in grand causes or noble missions she had fought for Marley, because it meant survival for her father, the one person she cared about. Now her father was somewhere ahead of the rumbling, likely already dead or about to die, and she had nothing left except the slim hope that stopping Eren might create a world where senseless killing finally ended. Peakfinger, the Cart Titan, brought crucial intelligence about Marleyan military capabilities and tactical experience that the Paradise forces lacked. She had served Marley loyally, not out of hatred for Eldians, but from pragmatic recognition that the warrior program represented the only path to security and relative prosperity for her and her family. Peak was analytical and observant, capable of setting aside personal grudges to focus on practical objectives. She joined the Alliance because she understood that the rumbling would kill everyone she had ever known, and because she recognized that Eren represented a threat even to the concept of civilization itself. Falco Grice, the youngest of the group, had gained the Jaw Titan's power in circumstances he barely understood, consuming a Titan that had previously consumed Porco Galliard. He was a child thrust into war, innocent in ways that made the others protective of him, even while relying on his Titan's capabilities. His presence in the Alliance represented hope, the possibility that someone could emerge from this cycle of violence without being corrupted or broken by it. Gabi Braun, who had killed Sasha and attempted to kill Eren, had undergone a radical transformation in her understanding of the world. Growing up in Marley, she had been the most fervent believer in anti-Eldian propaganda, convinced that her people deserved their treatment and that loyalty to Marley could earn them redemption. But her time on Paradise meeting people she had been taught to see as devils and discovering they were human had shattered her indoctrination. She still struggled with guilt over Sasha's death, knowing that Sasha had been someone's friend and comrade, that her death had caused real pain. Gabi's journey from zealous warrior candidate to Alliance member represented the possibility that ideological hatred could be overcome through personal connection. Onyankopon, a man from a nation that had been conquered by Marley, brought an outsider's perspective to the group. He had joined Marley's military under duress, his homeland having been absorbed into the Empire, but had allied with the Eldian restorationists and eventually with Paradise because he believed in self-determination for all oppressed peoples. He had helped bring the first aircraft to Paradise, had worked to modernize the island's capabilities, and now found himself fighting to prevent genocide while recognizing the bitter irony that his own people would be among those the rumbling killed. The Alliance formed not from shared ideology or mutual trust, but from shared recognition that Eren had to be stopped. They did not agree on what should happen after Eren's defeat, had no unified vision for the future, carried personal grudges and historical traumas that would not disappear simply because they fought together temporarily. But they agreed on the immediate necessity, and in a world where the ground shook with the footsteps of millions of colossal titans, that agreement was sufficient. They commandeered an aircraft, a flying boat that had been developed for long-distance reconnaissance, and flew toward Eren's position. The journey took them over landscapes already devastated by the rumbling, regions reduced to flattened ruins, still smoking from the heat of Titan passage. Looking down from the aircraft, they could see the true scale of what Eren had set in motion. Entire cities were just compressed debris forests, had become fields of ash, rivers had been diverted or boiled away. The land looked as if it had been crushed beneath a massive stamp, All variation and life pressed into uniform flatness. The Alliance knew they were flying toward almost certain death. Eren commanded millions of Titans, and the power to manifest past Titan shifters to defend his position. He had made clear through his message in the paths that he would not stop, that he considered what he was doing necessary and just. They would have to fight through his defenses, reach his true body located somewhere within the monstrous founding Titan, form and kill him if they could not convince him to stop voluntarily. The odds of success were minimal, and success itself would likely result in their own deaths, but they flew toward the battle anyway, knowing it was all they could do. The Alliance pursued the founding Titan as it marched toward Fort Salta, the last major concentration of human survivors in the southern continent, but their progress was contested every step of the way. Eren's forces included not just the millions of colossal Titans, but also the past Titan shifters that Ymir manifested from the paths to defend the rumbling. These warriors from history appeared on the battlefield, without will or personality. Puppets controlled through the founding Titan's power, attacking anyone who attempted to interfere with Eren's march. The Alliance's aircraft, their only means of reaching Eren before he completed the destruction of all human life beyond Paradise, became the focus of desperate defense. The flying boat was not designed for combat, had minimal armor and no weapons, served purely as transportation. But it was also irreplaceable, the only aircraft they had access to, and without it they had no chance of catching Eren's founding Titan before it trampled everything in its path. When the aircraft developed mechanical problems during the journey, problems severe enough that continued flight might result in catastrophic failure, they were forced to land and attempt repairs. They landed on a coastal settlement, a place that had been a port city, but was now abandoned, its population having fled ahead of the rumbling. The mechanics among them, particularly on Yankopan, who had engineering expertise, assessed the damage and determined that repairs were possible, but would take hours. Hours they did not have, because scouts reported that a force of Titans was approaching, drawn to their position by the aircraft's presence. The approaching force included not just pure Titans, but also some of the past Titan shifters that Eren had deployed to protect his advance. Hangzhou, the commander of the Survey Corps, recognized immediately what needed to be done. Someone would have to delay the approaching Titans long enough for the repairs to be completed and for the aircraft to take off safely. It was a suicide mission, but it was necessary. Hang announced her intention to buy them time, preparing her ODM gear and checking her blade supply with the calm efficiency of someone who had fought Titans for years and knew exactly what she was committing to. The others protested, arguing that they should all fight together, that there had to be another way, but Hangi was correct in her assessment, and she knew it. The aircraft could not carry everyone, and also have fuel reserves for the long flight to Eren's position. More importantly, Hangi had been carrying the burden of command since Erwin's death, making decisions that cost lives, trying to find paths forward when every option led to tragedy. She was tired in ways that went beyond physical exhaustion, tired of sending people to die, tired of the impossible moral calculus that leadership required. This was something she could do, a clear sacrifice with a clear purpose, perhaps the cleanest choice she had made since inheriting the Survey Corps. Hangi ordered Armin to take command of the Corps after her death, pressing the responsibility onto him before he could refuse. She made a few brief goodbyes, telling each of them that their struggles had meant something, that their attempts to find another path were worthwhile, even if they failed. Then she launched herself into the air with her ODM gear, flying toward the approaching horde of colossal Titans that were emerging from the ocean, their massive forms steaming as they transitioned from water to land. Fighting colossal Titans with ODM gear was different from fighting normal Titans. The size differential was too extreme for conventional tactics. Cutting the nape of the neck required reaching a target that was 60 meters off the ground, positioned on a Titan whose body radiated lethal heat, whose movements could kill with incidental contact. Hangi's strategy was not to kill the colossal Titans, which was effectively impossible for a single soldier, but to slow them down, to damage their eyes and interfere with their movement enough to buy crucial minutes for the aircraft repairs. She flew between the Titans, targeting their faces with her blades, cutting at their eyes to blind them and make their advance more difficult. The heat was intense, burning her exposed skin, singeing her hair, making each breath painful. Her Oddengier's gas canisters were depleting rapidly, the mechanisms not designed for sustained combat against enemies this large. She knew she had minutes at most before the equipment failed, or the heat killed her. She fought anyway, slashing and moving, drawing the Titan's attention toward herself and away from the aircraft. Her blades dulled and broke against the tough flesh of colossal Titans. She swapped them out for fresh ones, going through her blade supply at an unsustainable rate. Her gas reserves dropped toward critical levels. The heat kept intensifying as more Titans emerged from the water, their combined temperature turning the entire area into a furnace. Hangiz's body was burning, her clothes catching fire, her skin blistering from the radiant heat. The pain was overwhelming, but she kept fighting, kept moving, buying seconds and minutes with her life. Behind her, the Alliance worked frantically on the aircraft repairs. They could see Hangin fighting, could see the Titans she was holding off, understood exactly what she was sacrificing. They worked with desperate speed, knowing that every minute they delayed was purchased with Commander Hangiz's suffering. The repairs were completed, the engine tested, and found functional. The aircraft was ready to fly. Hangiz's Oddgear finally failed. The gas exhausted, the mechanisms burning from heat exposure, she fell, no longer able to maneuver. As she dropped toward the ground, she saw the aircraft taking off, rising into the sky, escaping with the people she had bought time for. She felt satisfaction at that, knowing her death had served a purpose. Then a colossal Titan's foot came down, crushing her instantly, her last sight being the aircraft flying toward its destination. The Alliance, watching from the departing aircraft, saw Hangi fall. Levi, who had fought beside her for years, who had lost Erwin and now lost Heng, gave her a final salute, acknowledging her sacrifice. The rest of the group stood in silence, processing the loss, knowing they owed their continued chance at stopping Eren to the time Hangi had bought them. Armin carried the burden of command now, as she had ordered, though he felt utterly unprepared for the weight of it. They flew toward Fort Salta, where Eren's founding Titan was approaching, where the final confrontation would take place. They carried Hanga's sacrifice with them, one more name added to the list of those who had died, trying to break the cycle of hatred and violence. The aircraft crossed over devastated landscapes, approaching the last battlefield, knowing that they were flying toward their own likely deaths, but committed to seeing it through regardless. Eren survived, emerging in yet another Titan form to continue the fight. In a last desperate act, the source of all living matter, the parasite creature that had originally fused with Ymir, emerged from Eren's Titan. It released a gas that transformed all nearby Eldians into Titans, creating a final army to protect itself. Jean, Connie, and Gabby were among those transformed. Only Mikasa, Levi, and the Titan shifters remained human. Mikasa entered the mouth of the founding Titan, finding Eren's true body within. She had been searching for a way to save him throughout everything, hoping that the boy she loved could be reasoned with. But in the paths, Eren had already shown her an alternate reality, a dream where they had run away together and lived peacefully until his time ran out. He had shown her that he knew what he was doing, that he accepted his death as necessary. Mikasa, understanding, finally, that Eren had chosen this path and would not turn back, made her own choice. She drew her blade and decapitated him. The moment Eren died, everything changed. The Titans stopped moving the gas that had transformed Jean, and the others dissipated, and they returned to human form. The colossal Titans of the rumbling collapsed, their animation ending most significantly. The power of the Titans ceased to exist after 2,000 years. The curse of Ymir was broken. No more 13-year limits, no more transformation, no more mindless pure Titans. The subjects of Ymir were just humans again. Mikasa carried Eren's severed head away from the battlefield. She brought it to Paradise and buried it under a tree. The same tree where Eren had woken from his strange dream years earlier. The same kind of tree where Ymir had found the source of all living matter. The rumbling had destroyed approximately 80% of humanity. Outside Paradise, entire nations were gone. Billions dead, ecosystems devastated. The survivors, both from Paradise and from the outside world, faced the aftermath of the most catastrophic event in human history. Armin and the other members of the Alliance became ambassadors attempting to negotiate peace between Paradise and what remained of the outside world. They were credited as heroes for stopping the rumbling, but the hatred that had led to the catastrophe did not disappear immediately. Years passed. Historia, who had become pregnant before the rumbling, raised her child in a world where Titans no longer existed. The Survey Corps was reorganized, its purpose shifting from fighting Titans to handling international diplomacy and defense. Paradis began industrializing, building its own military forces without relying on Titan power. But tensions remained. The Yeagerists who had supported Eren's actions maintained significant power on the island, and they did not trust the outside world any more than the outside world trusted them. Decades past the generation that had fought in the rumbling, grew old and died Mikasa. It was said, was buried next to Eren's grave, her long life finally ending in old age. New generations grew up in a world where Titans were history, where the curse of Ymir was a story from the past. But the cycle of hatred and war did not end. Paradis, having survived and industrialized, eventually found itself at war again with other nations. The city built on the island was destroyed in bombing raids, reduced to rubble by the descendant technologies of the same world Eren had tried to eliminate. More time passed. The ruins of Paradis were reclaimed by nature. Trees grew through the broken buildings, and eventually, a child walking with a dog through the forest found an enormous tree. This tree, grown from the roots of the one where Eren had been buried, had a hollow at its base, an opening that looked inviting. The child approached just as Ymir had approached a similar tree. 2,000 years earlier, the story ended, there leaving the question unresolved. Would the cycle begin again? Was the power of the Titans truly gone, or could it return? The answer remained unknown, lost in the future that stretched ahead. The complete history of the attack on Titan universe, from the moment Ymir fell into that first tree until the moment another child found another tree, spans roughly 2,000 years of human suffering and hope and violence and the search for freedom. It is a story of how power corrupts and enslaves both its wielders and its victims, how hatred compounds across generations, and how the attempt to break free from cycles of violence often perpetuates those very cycles. The Titans themselves, massive and terrifying, as they were proved to be less monstrous than the human choices that created and maintained them. The real horror was never the creatures with fanged mouths and steaming flesh, but the systems of oppression, the inherited trauma and the willingness to sacrifice millions in pursuit of security or revenge. The Eldians behind the walls lived for 100 years believing a comfortable lie about their place in the world. When that lie shattered, they faced the uncomfortable truth that their existence threatened others, that they carried in their blood the potential for transformation into monsters, that their ancestors had committed atrocities that the world had not forgotten. Some accepted guilt for sins they did not personally commit. Others rejected that guilt, arguing that children should not pay for their parents' crimes. This tension between collective and individual responsibility, between inherited sin and personal innocence, drove much of the tragedy that followed. Eren Yeager, the protagonist who became the antagonist, embodied this conflict. He witnessed his mother being eaten, spent years believing Titans were mindless evil, then learned they were victims. Like him, he discovered that humanity beyond the walls wanted him and everyone he loved dead just for existing. The rage and helplessness he felt as a child watching his mother die never left him, only grew and festered until it consumed not just him, but the entire world. His choice to activate the rumbling was born from desperation, trauma, and a fatalistic vision of a future where his people would always be threatened. Whether that choice could be called necessary, justified, or understandable remains a question with no single answer. The alliance that formed to stop Eren represented a different philosophy, the belief that cycles can be broken through choice rather than force. They chose to fight alongside former enemies, to trust people who had tried to kill them, to risk their own nation's safety for the hope of a better world. Their success in stopping the rumbling was not a complete victory. They saved 20% of humanity outside Paradis, but 80% still died. They ended the Titan curse, but not human conflict. The peace they hoped to build remained fragile, threatened by the same hatreds that had caused everything. Ymir, Fritz herself, the first Titan and the slave who started it all, found liberation only through Mikasa's choice. Mikasa, who loved Eren, but killed him anyway, who chose to do what was right, even though it destroyed her heart, showed Ymir that love did not require eternal servitude. A woman, killing the man she loved to save the world, broke the chains that had held Ymir in bondage for 2,000 years. The slave who had never been allowed to choose anything finally saw someone make the hardest choice imaginable, and that sight freed her. The history of the Titans, from beginning to end, is ultimately about choices made under impossible circumstances. Ymir chose to die when she could have lived. King Fritz chose to retreat rather than fight. Karl Fritz chose to condemn his people to ignorant imprisonment. Eren chose genocide rather than sacrifice Mika's. Chose duty over love. Each choice rippled forward, affecting millions, shaping centuries. The question that the story leaves behind is whether humans can ever break free from the choices of the past, or whether history is a cycle that will always repeat, with new players acting out the same tragic roles. The Attack on Titan universe is not one of clear heroes and villains. It is a world where almost everyone can justify their actions, where motivations are complex and overlapping, where the line between victim and perpetrator shifts, depending on the scale of history being examined. The Eldians were oppressors, who became oppressed, who became oppressors. Again, the Marleyans were victims who became oppressors, who became oppressors. The cycle of revenge and counter-revenge, extending across generations, created a situation where peace seemed impossible and violence inevitable. What makes this history particularly haunting is how recognizable it feels. The hatred between Eldians and Marleyans mirrors real-world ethnic and national conflicts, where grievances compound across generations, where children are taught to hate before they can understand why. The internment zones, the armbands, the genocide, these elements recall the darkest chapters of human history, reminding us that the Titans, despite their fantastic nature, are not the most unrealistic element of the story. What seems most implausible is not the giant monsters, but the possibility that humans might choose peace over revenge, understanding over hatred. The Survey Corps represented this possibility throughout their existence. They were people who chose to venture beyond the walls, not for glory or power, but for knowledge and freedom. Commander Erwin, who died seeking the truth, hanging, who pursued understanding even of creatures that wanted to eat them. Levi, who fought for no grand idealism, but for the memory of friends who had fallen. Armin, who believed that talking could solve what fighting could not. These people, flawed and human as they were, chose to be better than what the world demanded of them. And yet, the story acknowledges that individual goodness is not enough to change systemic problems. For all their sacrifice and bravery could not prevent the rumbling. They could stop it once it started, but they could not address the conditions that made someone like Eren possible. The hatred between nations, the fear of the Titans, the unwillingness of any side to break the cycle first. These were problems too large for any single group to solve. The ending, with its image of a child approaching a tree, suggests that the fundamental problem remains unresolved. The Titans may be gone, but the conditions that created the Titans still exist. As long as humans divide themselves into groups, as long as they fight over resources and ideology, as long as they pass trauma and hatred to their children, the potential for another catastrophe remains. The tree, grown from where Eren was buried, invites speculation. Did it contain another source of all living matter? Could the Titans return? The story does not answer, and perhaps cannot answer. The future is always uncertain, always shaped by choices not yet made. What can be said with certainty is that the Attack on Titan universe, across its 2 millennia of history, served as a reminder of the costs of power, the weight of history, and the difficulty of freedom. Real freedom, not the freedom to choose who to kill or which enemy to destroy, but the freedom to live without hatred, to build something other than walls, to raise children who do not inherit their parents' wars. That kind of freedom, the story suggests, might be the most elusive thing of all, more difficult to achieve than slaying any Titan, more costly than any battle. It requires not just strength or courage, but the willingness to be vulnerable, to trust those who have hurt you, to risk everything for a future that might never come. Whether humanity within that world can achieve such freedom remains the unanswered question at the heart of everything that happened. In the paths, Ymir's liberation manifested as both instantaneous and gradual, a psychological transformation that had been building across 2,000 years, finally reaching completion in a single moment of recognition. Her bondage had never been physical in the way that slavery usually manifests. After her death, there were no chains that could physically hold her, no master who could compel her service through force. The chains were psychological constructs, built from love twisted by trauma, from the desperate need to find meaning in suffering, from the conviction that her worth came only through service to the one who had enslaved her. Ymir had loved King Fritz, a truth that makes her story more tragic rather than less. She had convinced herself that her devotion gave purpose to her pain, that serving him and his descendants provided structure to existence that would otherwise be meaningless. When Fritz died, she could have stopped, could have let the Titan power die with him. But she continued building bodies in the paths for 2,000 years, responding to commands from people she had never met, perpetuating a system that caused immeasurable suffering. Because that service was all she knew, because abandoning it meant confronting the emptiness at the core of her existence. What Ymir had been waiting for, though she herself might not have consciously understood it, was permission to stop loving someone who had never deserved that love. She needed to witness another person make the choice she had been unable to make, to see another woman place principle above devotion, duty above desire, to understand that sometimes the most loving act is to say no, to refuse, to enable further harm, even when that refusal breaks your heart. Mikasa, killing Eren, tears streaming down her face as she did what she knew was necessary, despite the cost to her own soul, showed Ymir that love does not mean submission, that caring for someone does not require supporting their choices when those choices lead to destruction. This realization shattered the patterns that had defined Ymir's existence since her first transformation. The paths, that infinite desert beneath the starless sky, began to dissolve. The sand that had crunched beneath feet for 2 millennia started blowing away in winds that came from nowhere and everywhere. The tree, that massive organism representing the coordinate in the branching of all Eldian lives, began to crumble, its impossible branches breaking off and disintegrating, its trunk collapsing in slow motion as the force that had sustained it withdrew. Ymir herself, the small dirt-covered girl who had carried the weight of empires and genocides, simply faded away, her form becoming translucent, then transparent, then nothing at all. Her consciousness finally granted the rest it had been denied for so long. The immediate aftermath was one of shock and disbelief. The rumbling stopped, as if a switch had been flipped across devastated continents. The colossal titans collapsed. Their massive bodies fell like puppets whose strings were cut, some toppling forward to crush ruins they had just created, others falling backward, their impacts creating new craters in already flattened landscapes. The constant steam that rose from their bodies dissipated the ground, which had been trembling continuously for days, finally stilled. A quiet so profound after days of thunderous footsteps that survivors thought at first that they had gone deaf. The pure titans that had been created by the parasite's gas transformed back. Jean woke up human, confused and disoriented, his memories of his time as a titan fragmentary and nightmarish. Connie found himself lying on the ground, his body intact, uncertain how he was alive. Gabby transformed back, standing in the ruins of Fort Salta, her mind struggling to process what had happened. The transformation reversed itself completely when the Titan curse ended, providing one final mercy in a world that had seen too little of it. The past Titan shifters who had been fighting as Eren's defenders simply vanished, their temporary manifestations ending as the power that sustained them withdrew. Grisha disappeared, his last act having been to fight against the very outcome he had once tried to bring about. Eren Yeager faded back into history, all the warriors from 2,000 years of inheritance, briefly recalled to defend. The rumbling returned to whatever rest-dead souls are granted the 9 Titans, powers that had shaped human civilization since Ymir's daughters consumed their mother ceased to exist. The curse of Ymir ended for those still living. Armin felt it immediately, a lifting of pressure he had grown so accustomed that he had stopped noticing it consciously. The 13-year countdown that had been ticking in the background of every Titan shifter's awareness simply stopped. Reiner and Annie and Peak, Falco, all of them felt the change, understanding in that moment that they would not die from their inherited powers, that they could live normal lifespans if they survived the immediate dangers of the post-rumbling world. The curse that had defined inheritance since Ymir's first transformation had ended, releasing its final victims from a sentence they had never deserved to serve. The death toll from the rumbling would never be known with precision. 80% was the common estimate, but the real number might have been higher or lower depending on how populations were calculated and what regions were counted. 3 billion people had lived before the rumbling began, perhaps. 600 million survived, though even that number was uncertain. Entire nations were gone, their populations exterminated down to the last person, their cities reduced to compressed debris, their cultures erased so thoroughly that future historians would have only fragmentary evidence that they had ever existed. The infrastructure that supported global civilization was destroyed across vast regions. Roads and rail lines were crushed beneath Titan feet. Communication networks that had connected distant cities were severed. Power generation facilities were destroyed. Water treatment systems were flattened. The agricultural systems that fed populations were devastated. Crops crushed, irrigation destroyed, farmland compressed and contaminated. Cities that had once housed millions were reduced to rubble fields, stretching kilometers in every direction. Any structure taller than a single story crushed flat. Streets and buildings indistinguishable in the uniform devastation. The environmental damage was catastrophic and enduring. The ash and smoke from burning cities and forests darkened the sky for months, creating atmospheric effects that disrupted weather patterns across the planet. The destruction of so much forest meant reduced capacity for the Earth to process carbon dioxide, contributing to long-term climate changes. Rivers were contaminated with debris and the decomposition products of millions of corpses. The heat from the colossal titans had boiled some rivers, completely altering drainage patterns and creating new deserts in areas that had once supported life. Species of plants and animals went extinct when the rumbling destroyed their habitats. The biodiversity loss representing genetic potential that could never be recovered. Yet survivors endured, because that is what survivors do. In regions the Titans had not reached, in areas fortunate enough to be far from the march's path, people emerged from shelters and began the work of recovery. Refugees who had fled ahead of the destruction returned to find their homes gone. But they dug through ruins anyway, searching for anything salvageable, looking for remains of loved ones to bury with dignity. They organized into new communities, combining remnants of different populations into hybrid societies that incorporated whoever was left, regardless of previous nationality or ethnicity. Armin Arlelt and the other Alliance members became ambassadors in this shattered world, attempting to negotiate peace between Paradise and what remained of the outside world. They were called heroes for stopping the rumbling, credited with saving the fraction of humanity that survived. But that heroism was complicated by their identity as Eldians from Paradise, representatives of the island that had unleashed this devastation. The survivors hated Paradise, wanted revenge, struggled to see any distinction between Eren Yeager and the people who had fought to stop him. The negotiations were tense and exhausting, conducted in temporary structures built from salvaged materials between representatives of communities that had every reason to distrust each other. Armin argued that the cycle of hatred had to end somewhere, that punishing Paradise for Eren's actions would simply perpetuate the violence that had defined the past 2,000 years. He pointed out that Eldians were no longer capable of transforming into Titans, that the biological curse that had justified 2,000 years of persecution no longer existed, that the threat was gone, and with it any justification for continued conflict. He offered reparations, though what Paradise could provide to people who had lost everything was unclear. The island had resources, fossil fuels and minerals, that the world needed for rebuilding, and Paradise could offer these at favorable terms. He proposed joint recovery efforts, Paradise sending workers and materials to help rebuild destroyed regions, Eldians and non-Eldians working side by side to construct a future that neither could achieve separately. He emphasized that the alternative to cooperation was continued warfare, and no side had the strength or resources to sustain prolonged conflict in the immediate aftermath of such devastation. Some nations accepted these proposals, recognizing that practical survival demanded cooperation regardless of emotional desire for revenge. Others refused, unable to forgive or forget, determined to make Paradise pay for its crimes, even if that payment came at the cost of their own recovery. Factions formed among the survivors, some advocating reconciliation, others demanding justice through punishment. Disagreements about the proper response, creating new conflicts, even as communities struggled with basic survival. The world remained fractured, resentful, traumatized by losses that could never be recovered or adequately mourned. But large-scale warfare did not immediately resume. The survivors were too exhausted, too focused on food and shelter, and rebuilding basic infrastructure to mount military campaigns. The Alliance members had bought time, created a period of uneasy peace that might be used to build genuine understanding or might simply delay inevitable conflict. The outcome remained uncertain, dependent on choices not yet made, on whether trauma would calcify into permanent hatred or gradually soften through contact and cooperation. Mikasa Ackerman did not participate in these diplomatic efforts. She returned to Paradise alone, carrying Eren's head wrapped in the scarf he had given her years earlier. She traveled to a hillside outside what remained of Shiganshina, to a place where a tree grew, and buried Eren's head there. She planted flowers around the grave, tended it carefully, visited every week, despite the long journey from where she lived. She spoke to Eren during these visits, telling him about the world he could not see, about the peace the Alliance was trying to build, about her memories of simpler times, before everything became complicated by history and hatred. Mikasa never married, never sought another relationship, lived a quiet life, defined partly by grief and partly by determination to honor those who had died by making their sacrifices mean something. She wore Eren's scarf constantly, a red reminder of the day he had saved her, of the boy he had been before duty and destiny transformed him into something she could not follow. She lived long, her Ackerman bloodline granting her strength and endurance that extended her years beyond what most people experienced. When she finally died of old age, many decades after the rumbling, she was buried next to Eren, the scarf wrapped around her neck. The two of them reunited in death, in a way they could never be in life. Years became decades, decades became generations. The immediate survivors of the rumbling aged and died, replaced by children who had not witnessed the events firsthand, who knew the horror only through education and commemoration. These younger generations had their own concerns and conflicts, shaped by but not bound to relive their parents' traumas. Paradise grew and developed, transforming from an isolated island into a modern nation participating in global trade and diplomacy. The Survey Corps was reorganized, its purpose shifting from fighting titans to managing international relations and providing defense against conventional military threats. There was no more need for three-dimensional mobility gear, no more expeditions beyond walls that no longer existed, no more battles against monsters that had ceased to be. Some of the old guard, like Levi Ackerman, retired to quiet lives, their bodies too damaged from years of combat to continue active service, their spirits too weary from losses and sacrifices to engage with the new world. Others, like Armin and the surviving Alliance members, took leadership roles, using their experience and credibility to build bridges between communities that had once been enemies. Paradise's internal politics evolved as different factions competed for control of the island's direction. The Aerists, who had supported Eren's actions, maintained significant influence by arguing that the rumbling, despite its horror, had been necessary to ensure Eldian survival. They pointed out that Paradise was alive and independent, that the outside world had indeed been planning genocide, that Eren had simply struck first in a war that was already inevitable. They honored Eren as a martyr who had sacrificed himself for his people's freedom building. monuments to his memory, teaching children that he had been a tragic hero rather than a mass murderer. Opposing political factions argued that the rumbling had been a moral catastrophe that could never be justified, regardless of the threat that inspired it, that Paradise needed to acknowledge the atrocity and work toward genuine atonement, rather than celebrating or excusing what had happened. They emphasized that genocide was genocide regardless of motivation, that killing billions to save millions could not be rationalized through strategic necessity. These groups advocated for ongoing reparations, for education that emphasized the suffering caused rather than the protection achieved, for a national identity built on acknowledgement of wrongdoing rather than defensive pride. These political divisions never fully resolved, creating a society where different communities held fundamentally incompatible views of their own history. As the generation that had experienced the rumbling firsthand died off, the debates shifted from lived memory to abstract principle. Arguments conducted by people who had not smelled burning cities or heard millions of footsteps shaking the earth. The emotional immediacy faded, replaced by historical analysis and political positioning, the horror becoming something that happened in the past rather than something that defined the present. A century passed after the rumbling. Paradise had become thoroughly modern, its cities rivaling anything on the mainland, its economy integrated into global trade networks, its military conventional rather than relying on supernatural threats. The technology that had once been exclusive to more advanced nations became common on the island. Buildings rose higher than the old walls had stood, monuments to human ambition unbound by the fear that had defined previous generations. Commerce thrived, culture flourished, art and literature and science developed in ways that isolation had never permitted. But the underlying tensions, the historical grievances that the rumbling had created, never fully disappeared. The outside world, having recovered and rebuilt, retained institutional memories of destruction. Textbooks taught children about the rumbling. Museums displayed artifacts from destroyed cities. National commemorations marked the dates when the colossal titans had reached their countries. Paradis, proud and defensive, refused to continually apologize for actions its current population had not committed, actions that its citizens increasingly saw as historical events rather than ongoing moral debts. New conflicts arose, mixing historical animosity with contemporary disputes over resources, territory, and political influence. Economic competition created friction as Paradise's abundant natural resources gave it advantages in global markets. Territorial disputes emerged as nations rebuilt and sought to reclaim lands that had been abandoned during the rumbling. Ideological differences deepened, with some nations moving toward authoritarian systems, while others embraced democracy. Disagreements about governance translating into international tensions. The specific reasons for conflict evolved and multiplied, but underlying them all was the unresolved resentment from the rumbling. The sense that Paradise had literally gotten away with murder, that justice had never been adequately served. Approximately 120 years after the rumbling, tensions escalated into open warfare. The causes were complex and numerous, involving trade disputes that spiraled into sanctions, territorial claims that led to military posturing, alliance networks that turned localized conflicts into broader confrontations. But at root, the war represented the return of patterns that the rumbling had failed to eliminate. The cycle of violence and revenge reasserting itself. Despite a century of relative peace, this new war was fought with technology that made the Titans look primitive. Bombers flew over Paradise, aircraft that could drop explosives from heights that made anti-aircraft fire ineffective, weapons that flattened city blocks with single impacts. Artillery systems with ranges of dozens of kilometers targeted military installations and infrastructure, their accuracy guided by sophisticated targeting systems. The actual fighting was brief but devastating. Paradise's military unable to withstand the coordinated assault from nations that had spent decades preparing for exactly this conflict. The capital city, built on the ruins of the old walled settlement, was reduced to rubble within days. Bombs destroyed the government buildings, the residential districts, everything that had represented Paradise's emergence as a modern nation. Other cities across the island suffered similar fates. The war was not about occupation or conquest, but about punishment, about finally making Paradise pay for what Eren had done, about satisfying the desire for revenge that had simmered for more than a century. The tree where Eren and Mikasa were buried survived, the bombing standing alone in a crater that had once been a thriving neighborhood, its branches spread wide, its trunk thick and gnarled with age, its roots deep enough to withstand the shockwaves that leveled everything around it. The grave markers were destroyed, the carefully tended flowers burned away, but the tree endured, a living connection to a past that the present kept trying to escape or destroy or make sense of. More time passed. The war ended, its objectives achieved or abandoned, depending on perspective, its outcome creating new grievances that would motivate future conflicts. Paradise recovered, slowly rebuilding yet again, its population diminished but surviving, its national identity shaped by repeated cycles of destruction and renewal. The survivors of this new war told their children about the bombing, just as their grandparents had told them about the rumbling passing trauma, across generations in the way humans always have. Decades became another century. The specific conflicts that had motivated the recent war faded into history books, the dead becoming statistics, the reasons simplified by historians into narratives that made sense of chaos. Paradise continued its pattern of growth and destruction, periods of prosperity interrupted by wars that set everything back, each generation hoping their rebuilding efforts would be permanent, and each generation eventually proven wrong. The cities were abandoned, and reclaimed following patterns of human migration and conflict that had nothing to do with titans or curses, but everything to do with the basic dynamics of power and fear. Nature slowly reasserted itself in areas that humans vacated. Grass growing through broken concrete, trees sprouting in collapsed buildings, animals nesting in ruins that had once been homes and offices and schools. Roughly 200 years after Eren's death, more than 2 centuries after the rumbling that had killed billions, the land where Paradise had stood was partially reclaimed by wilderness. Some cities still functioned, but others had been abandoned to nature, their ruins serving as archaeological sites, or simply ignored as people focused on contemporary concerns. The specific location where Eren had been buried was wilderness now, forest having grown over what remained of the bombed settlements. A child walked through this forest accompanied by a dog exploring on a pleasant afternoon, when curiosity pulled them beyond the familiar paths. The child had no knowledge of what had happened in this place 2 centuries earlier, no awareness of the grave that lay somewhere beneath the earth, no understanding of the cycles of violence and peace that had played out across these grounds. There was just the forest, the dog running ahead and sniffing at interesting scents, the child following with the casual confidence of someone who has never experienced real danger. They found a tree, massive and ancient, its trunk hollowed by age or lightning or some other force. The hollow opening looked inviting, mysterious in the way that draws curious children. The entrance was dark, suggesting depths that extended beyond what light could reach. The dog approached first, sniffing at the opening, tail wagging with excitement at new smells. The child followed, reaching toward the hollow, fingers extended to touch the bark, to peer into the darkness, to discover what secrets the tree might hold. The story ended there, the final image frozen at that moment of possibility and uncertainty. Whether the child entered the tree, whether anything waited inside, whether the power of the Titans could somehow return after 200 years, and the complete destruction of the curse. These questions were deliberately left unresolved. The ending was not a conclusion, but a continuation, a suggestion that cycles might repeat, that history might echo itself across centuries, that the patterns which had defined this world might be eternal rather than temporary. Or perhaps it meant nothing. Perhaps the tree was simply a tree, worn by time, hollowed by natural processes, containing nothing but darkness and maybe some insects or small animal. Perhaps the child looked inside, found it empty or uninteresting, and simply walked away to explore other parts of the forest. Perhaps the apparent parallels to Ymir's story were coincidence rather than prophecy, the human tendency to find patterns creating meaning where only randomness existed. The ambiguity was intentional offering, no definitive answer, about whether humanity could ever truly escape the patterns that defined it, or whether those patterns were fundamental aspects of existence that would reassert themselves, regardless of how many times people tried to break free. The question of whether the cycle could end or must continue remained open, inviting each person who encountered the story to reach their own conclusions, based on their own understanding of human nature, history, and the possibility of genuine change. What remained indisputably true was that the attack on Titan universe, from Ymir's first transformation beneath that ancient tree to the unnamed child, approaching what might be the same kind of tree 2 millennia later, represented a sustained meditation on freedom and its costs, on power and its corruptions, on how trauma propagates across generations, on the difficulty of breaking cycles that seem designed to perpetuate themselves. The Titans, terrifying as they were, had been symptoms rather than causes, manifestations of deeper problems in human society and human nature. Their elimination had not solved those problems, had not ended suffering or injustice or war, because those issues existed independently of any supernatural curse. The complete history was therefore not merely a chronicle of events, but an exploration of questions that have no simple answers. Questions about when violence is justified and when it crosses into atrocity, about collective guilt versus individual responsibility, about whether ends can ever justify means, or whether some actions are wrong regardless of their outcomes. These questions persisted long after the Titans were gone, long after the specific characters and their struggles faded into history, because they are fundamentally human questions that each generation must answer for itself, usually imperfectly, always with consequences that extend beyond what anyone intended.